The Serpent Sage. Act 1. Venom and Silence. Chapter 1. The Valley That Forgot the Sun. The Descent. The valley had no name on any map that Issei Hyoudou had ever seen, and he had seen more maps in the past year than most humans would encounter in a lifetime. It existed between two ranges of the eastern mountains like a hell breath, the kind of geography that cartographers quietly avoided and travelers returned from with stories they could not quite put into coherent sentences. The locals called it Yamakawa, the River of Dark, though the river itself ran clear and cold and carried nothing more sinister than mountain sediment. The darkness, Issei would soon understand, referred to something else entirely. He arrived on foot, as instructed. The message had found him through the third intermediary in as many weeks, folded inside a dried lotus leaf and tucked beneath the door of the small room he rented above a stationery shop in Kyoto. The handwriting was precise to the point of being unsettling, each character drawn as though the writer had all the time in the world and fully intended to use every moment of it. The message read, "If you wish to understand the architecture of silence, come alone to the valley that breathes. Bring nothing that makes sound." He had left his phone. He had left the small travel bell that hung from his pack. He had even left behind the subtle jingle of a keyring, tucking his keys into a cloth pouch and wrapping it twice before placing it at the bottom of his bag. He was not certain whether this level of compliance was necessary or whether the instruction was a kind of test, but he was 20 years old, he had been in possession of the boosted gear for long enough to understand that power without discipline was simply destruction with extra steps, and he was not interested in destroying anything at the moment. The path narrowed as the tree cover thickened. This far from the road, the forest's composition shifted. The familiar stands of cedar and hinoki gave way to something older and less well lit, the canopy interlocking so thoroughly overhead that the sky appeared only in fragments, pale geometric shapes glimpsed between branches like pieces of a puzzle that had never been assembled correctly. The undergrowth was dense without being impenetrable, and Issei noted as he walked that certain plants grew in patterns that felt deliberate, clusters of nightshade and foxglove and hemlock arranged with a spacing that suggested cultivation rather than natural spread. Someone had been gardening here. Someone who found utility in things that were generally considered dangerous. He almost missed the first one. She was coiled around the upper branch of a black pine approximately 3 meters above the path, and the lower half of her body was the deep green-brown of the bark itself, the scales carrying the same rough texture and the same faint pattern of lichen that the tree displayed. She watched him pass from a position of absolute stillness, her upper body human in proportion and draped in a garment of woven moss and bark fiber, her dark eyes tracking him with the unhurried attention of something that had never once in its life needed to rush toward anything. Her tongue moved once, a brief flicker. Issei stopped. He looked up. He did not reach for the boosted gear. "You were told to come alone," she said. Her voice was the temperature of the forest, cool without being cold, carrying a faint undertone of something that resonated in the chest rather than the ears. "You brought your sacred gear." "It's part of my arm," Issei said. "Biologically speaking, I don't think I can leave it at the stationery shop." A pause. Something in her expression shifted by a fraction of a degree, which he would later learn was the Lamia equivalent of a smile. "Come," she said, and uncoiled from the branch in a single fluid motion that resolved itself into forward movement before he had fully registered that she had moved at all. The garden of considered things. The settlement, if it could be called that, was constructed on the principle of invisibility as an architectural philosophy. The structures were built against and around and partially within the rock face that formed the valley's eastern wall, their materials drawn entirely from the immediate environment so that from any distance greater than 20 meters the place simply ceased to be a thing that the eye registered. Rooftops of living moss. Walls of fitted stone that had been allowed to accumulate decades of weathering before any inhabitant moved in. Doorways hung with curtains of woven vine that moved in the same rhythm as the surrounding foliage. There were 12 of them. He counted as they emerged from their various positions of absolute concealment to observe his arrival, each face carrying the same quality of measured attention, each lower body the coiled musculature of something that had evolved over a very long time to be exactly as dangerous as it needed to be and no more dangerous than that. They ranged in age from what appeared to be late adolescence to something that defied comfortable estimation entirely, the eldest sitting at the center of the settlement's common area with a stillness that made the surrounding stones seem animated by comparison. Her scales were white. Not the white of albinism or illness, but the white of things that have passed through every other color and arrived at this one through a process of patient reduction, the way snow is white not because it lacks color but because it contains all of them simultaneously. She sat with a length of coiled tail that extended nearly 4 meters behind her, and she watched Issei cross the final distance between them without any expression that he could identify as welcoming or unwelcoming. She simply watched, and the act of being watched by her was the most comprehensive thing he had experienced in a considerable time. "Sit," she said. He sat on the flat stone across from her. The stone was cold and smooth and had been worn to this smoothness by what must have been centuries of the same use. "My name is Shirogane," she said. "I am the oldest living Lamia in this country, and the 7th oldest in the world, though I have not verified the count recently. You are Issei Hyoudou, who carries the twice critical in its second evolution, who has recently been spending considerable amounts of time studying the theoretical frameworks of power rather than its application, and who arrived in this valley because the message I sent you contained no flattery and no promise of benefit to yourself." "The no flattery part was how I knew it was genuine," Issei confirmed. "Most individuals who seek what we teach come here because they wish to become dangerous," Shirogane said. "They have a particular enemy in mind. They have a score to settle or a hierarchy to topple. They approach the arts of poison and concealment as tools for a specific purpose, and when that purpose is satisfied they set the tools down." She paused. "This is not incorrect. But it is limited. You didn't invite me because you think I have a specific enemy in mind," Issei said. "I invited you because of what you wrote." She produced a folded paper from somewhere within the folds of her garment, and set it on the stone between them. He recognized it as a page from the theoretical notebook he kept, the one he had been writing in during the months since the raiding game loss that had reorganized his understanding of what he did not yet know. The page she had selected was one of his more abstract entries, a series of questions about the relationship between visible power and actual influence, about whether the most effective interventions in a complex system were necessarily the visible ones. This is not the writing of someone who wishes to become dangerous. This is the writing of someone who wishes to understand danger as a category of phenomenon. "There's a difference," Issei agreed. "Yes," said Shirogane. "There is. And that difference is the only reason you are sitting on that stone instead of somewhere at the bottom of the valley where we put the people we decide not to teach." Issei looked at the stone beneath him. He looked at the gathered Lamia observing him from their various positions around the common area. He looked back at Shirogane, whose white scales caught the filtered light of the valley in a way that made her seem simultaneously present and elsewhere. "All right," he said. "When do we start?" "We started," Shirogane said, "when you chose not to reach for your sacred gear when Keiro observed you from the pine." Chapter 2, The Curriculum of Quiet. First Lessons in the Language of Stillness. The first week was dedicated entirely to the proposition that Issei Hyoudou did not know how to be still. This was not a criticism delivered verbally. No one in the settlement offered verbal criticism as a pedagogical instrument. Instead, Keiro, the Lamia who had observed him from the pine tree and who turned out to be something like a senior student herself, demonstrated stillness on the first morning by taking up a position at the center of the clearing and then simply ceasing to be the kind of presence that the eye could comfortably locate. She did not disappear. She did not employ any supernatural concealment. She was present in every technical sense of the word, and yet within 30 seconds Issei's gaze had passed over her twice without registering her as a distinct thing. The forest had absorbed her into its visual grammar. "How?" he said. "You will observe for 3 days," she said from somewhere directly in front of him. "Then you will attempt." He observed for 3 days. He took no notes because he had been told to bring nothing that made sound in a pen against paper. It turned out, made a sound that the Lamia found objectionable in the way that a poorly tuned instrument is objectionable to a musician, not painful, precisely, but indicating a fundamental misalignment of something that should be aligned. He committed his observations to memory instead, a practice he had been developing since the notebook theft had demonstrated that written notes were not always secure. What he observed, across those 3 days, was a philosophy of presence made physical. The Lamia moved differently from any supernatural being he had encountered previously, and he had encountered a considerable number. Devils, fallen angels, various strains of yokai, the occasional rogue spirit, all of them occupied space in a way that announced itself, the signature of power functioning like a continuous low-frequency broadcast. The Lamia did not broadcast. They operated on the assumption that the environment was primary and they were temporary features of it, and this assumption was not pretense but genuine orientation. They moved when they moved and were still when they were still, and neither state was performed for any audience. On the fourth morning, Keiro pointed at the clearing and said nothing further. Issei stood in the clearing for approximately 4 minutes before accepting that he had no idea where to begin. His power was fundamentally expressive. The boosted gear doubled strength in 10-second intervals, and its crown jewel, the transfer and balance breaker mechanics, were elaborate orchestrations of force that operated on the principle of accumulation and release. He had spent the past year learning to think about power as discipline rather than explosion, but discipline in his frame of reference had still meant controlled application of force. It had not meant the complete absence of a power signature. It had not meant this. Your gear is quiet now, Keiro observed from somewhere to his left. But you are not. You are radiating. Every cell in your body is broadcasting your location to anything that knows how to receive. I don't know how to stop that, Issei said. No, she agreed. That is why you are here for 3 months rather than 3 days. Venom as information. The poison curriculum began in the second week, and it was nothing like what he had expected. He had expected, if he was honest with himself, something clinical and slightly alarming, lists of toxins and their effects, preparation methods, delivery mechanisms. The kind of knowledge that was powerful in proportion to how uncomfortable it made a reasonable person feel. What he received instead was a lecture from Shirogane that lasted 4 hours and covered, in sequence, the history of communication between organisms, the evolution of chemical language in complex ecosystems, and the philosophical relationship between a toxin and its target. A poison is a sentence, Shirogane said. She was moving around the low table at which they sat, the long length of her tail marking a slow circuit of the room. It is a statement made by one organism to another. You have entered a space that does not accommodate you. A well-crafted poison is not an act of aggression. It is an act of information transfer. The organism receiving it is being told something true about its situation. And a poorly crafted poison? Issei asked. Is noise, she said. Indiscriminate. It damages what it was not intended to damage, and leaves the intended recipient less affected than the grammar of the situation required. Most beings who employ poison employ it as noise. They have a great deal of it, and they release it in the direction of a problem, and they are surprised when the problem resolves poorly. The old Satan faction, Issei said, and the room became very quiet in a way that was distinct from its usual quietness. Shirogane looked at him for a long moment. You were told to bring nothing that makes sound, she said. That seems like a relevant application, Issei said. I'm not going to pretend I came here for theoretical reasons alone. Another pause, longer than the first. Then no. And I did not invite you for theoretical reasons alone. But you will learn the grammar before you write the sentence. If you attempt to write a sentence in a language you do not yet possess, you will produce noise. She resumed her circuit of the room. And noise, she said, is what they expect from anyone who opposes them. Do not give them what they expect. The practical components of the poison curriculum were conducted by 2 of the younger Lamia, Swearin and Ao, who were sisters in the Lamias sense of the word, which meant they had been raised in the same cohort, and had developed complementary specialties through a combination of natural aptitude and shared environment. Swearin worked with contact toxins, the compounds that required only skin or scale proximity to transfer their information. Ao worked with aerosols and environmental dispersal, the art of convincing a space itself to become persuasive. Neither of them smiled much, but neither of them was unkind. They had the teaching manner of people who took their subjects seriously enough that condescension would have felt like an insult to the material rather than to the student. You will not be injecting anything, Swearin said on the first practical morning, surveying the assortment of preserved samples she had laid out on the workbench with the proprietorial air of someone displaying a personal collection. You lack the biological mechanism. What you will learn is identification, analysis, and application through secondary instruments. But before the instruments, the knowledge. Name these. He looked at the 12 samples. He recognized 3 of them from his observation walks in the cultivated garden. Monkshood, he said, indicating the first. Nightshade. And that's water hemlock rather than poison hemlock. The leaf pattern is different. Swearin looked at the samples, then at him, then at the samples again. Continue. I don't recognize the others, he admitted. Except that one on the end, which I think is a concentrated extract of something rather than a whole plant. It is a compound, Swearin said, and for the first time something in her manner shifted by a degree. Not warmth, exactly, but a recognition of competence that was close enough to warmth to function similarly. Most students at this stage cannot distinguish between plant and extract. You have been paying attention. I've been paying attention since I was told to bring nothing that makes sound, Issei said. I figured the instruction was representative of the general approach. It is, she said. Good. Sit. We begin with the 9 compounds that are native to this valley, because native knowledge is the foundation of all other knowledge. Once you can identify these with your eyes closed, using only touch and smell, we will move to synthesis. Issei sat. He did not mention that the idea of identifying toxins by touch and smell was the kind of proposal that warranted a certain amount of careful processing before full acceptance. He simply sat, and picked up the first sample, and began to learn. The arithmetic of concealment. The third discipline was the one he found hardest, and he found it hardest because it required him to dismantle something he had spent 2 years very deliberately constructing. His presence as a fighter was intentional. He had cultivated a particular quality of presence, a deliberateness of occupation of space that communicated in the language other supernatural beings understood. This individual is aware of you, is not afraid of you, and has made a considered decision about how to engage with you. This was not arrogance. It was the cultivated posture of someone who had been in enough situations where his initial lack of presence had been taken for weakness, and who had learned that making his presence legible early saved everyone time. The Lamia did not value legibility. You walk as though you are announcing yourself, said Nagi, the Lamia assigned to teach him what she called the arithmetic of concealment. She was somewhere between the ages of 30 and 300 in the way that supernatural beings often were, and her scales were the soft gray-green of old bronze, and she had a habit of conducting conversations from behind him. Not in a threatening way. In the way of a teacher who was demonstrating a lesson through the discomfort of the student. You walk as though your footfall is an argument that you are making. I thought confident movement was strategically useful, Issei said. In situations where you wish to be the subject of the conversation, yes, Nagi said. But there are other kinds of situations. There are situations where the most powerful position is the position that no one knows to account for. A piece on a game board that the opposing player does not know exists is not constrained by the rules that govern visible pieces. You understand this. Strategically, yes, he said. Physically, I'm still working on it. The physical work was conducted at dawn, when the valley mist provided both cover and feedback. He could measure his own presence by how the mist moved around him, the small disturbances his passage created, the way his body heat produced subtle convection patterns that the cold morning air made visible. Nagi was an unsparing observer of these patterns. She tracked him through the mist and delivered corrections with the precision of someone who had been studying the subject for long enough that she had moved beyond judgment into pure technical observation. Slower, she said, from somewhere to his right. Your impatience is a smell. The mist can feel it. He slowed. He breathed through his nose. He let his weight settle through his heels rather than carrying it in his chest where it tended to accumulate when he was thinking about something with his body engaged. Better, Nagi said, and the word arrived from a position so close that it took him a moment to process that she had covered the distance between them without his noticing. Do you feel the difference? I feel like I'm moving through water, he said. Yes, she said. That is what water feels like when you stop fighting it. Chapter 3. What the enemy does not expect. The architecture of the old Satan faction. In the 4th week, Shirogane sat him down and talked to him about the enemy. She did not call it a briefing. She called it a reading, and she conducted it the way a diagnostician reads a patient, systematically, without visible reaction to what she found, assembling observations into a picture that was complete before she offered any interpretation of it. The Lamia had been watching the old Satan faction for 3 decades, she explained, not because they had any particular quarrel with it but because the Lamia had been watching every significant power structure in the supernatural world for the past several centuries as a matter of professional habit. And the old Satan faction had become significant enough to warrant sustained attention approximately 30 years ago, when its foundational theology had solidified from grievance into doctrine. The theology is important, Shirogane said. Most people who study the old Satan faction study its military capabilities. They count the high-class devils who have aligned with it, the territories it controls, the armaments it has accumulated. They approach it as a force to be matched with equal or superior force. This is why they have not eliminated it in 3 decades of trying. Because you can't defeat a doctrine with a larger army, Issei said. You can, Shirogane said. If you are willing to be thorough enough. But the word for that is not victory. It is something else. She unrolled a long piece of treated bark paper on the table between them, covered in markings that he recognized as a kind of notational system different from any he had seen. The old Satan faction is not a military organization that has developed a justifying philosophy. It is a philosophy that has developed military instruments. This distinction determines where it is vulnerable. A philosophy is vulnerable to contradiction, Issei said slowly. If the doctrine says the world is a certain way, and you can demonstrate to enough of its adherents that the world is not that way, among other approaches. But contradiction requires evidence that the contradicted parties will accept as valid, and they control the epistemological frameworks of their own community. External contradiction rarely penetrates. She traced one of the markings on the bark paper. What penetrates is internal contradiction. The experience of doctrine failing its own members. The discovery that the people at the center of the philosophy do not themselves believe it. The revelation that the hierarchy has been using the doctrine as a tool rather than living by it. Which is true. It is almost always true, she said. The question is not whether it is true. The question is whether the people who need to know it will believe it when they learn it. And the answer to that question depends on how they learn it. Information delivered from outside a closed community is suspect. Information that members of the community discover themselves, through their own investigation, through their own experience of contradiction, is the only kind that reliably changes minds. Issei sat with this for a moment. You're describing a curriculum, he said. Shirogane looked at him. What do you mean? A curriculum is how you change what people know, and how they think without them feeling like they've been changed. You structure the environment so that they arrive at the conclusions themselves. You remove the experiences that support the old framework and introduce the experiences that support the new one. He paused. I've been on the receiving end of that recently. A bad loss in a rating game. It changed my framework more thoroughly than any argument could have, because I experienced it rather than being told it. Yes, Shirogane said, and this time the fraction of a degree expression appeared on her face with slightly more emphasis than he had seen before. That is precisely what I mean. The question before us is what curriculum we can arrange for the members of the old Satan faction that will produce the experiences they need to reconsider their framework. And this, she touched the bark paper, is 3 decades of data about what those experiences might be. The names and natures of the 12. He learned their names properly in the 5th week, when Shirogane decided that he had demonstrated sufficient respect for the material to be trusted with its sources. Keiro was 26, young for a Lamia, and had arrived at the valley 9 years ago from a region of northern Japan where her family had maintained a territory that the advancing sprawl of human development had steadily compressed until it was no longer viable as a home. She was the fastest of the 12, a specialist in what she called environmental transition, the art of moving from one kind of space to another without the characteristics of the first space accompanying you into the second. She could move from forest to urban landscape to underground structure to open water, and in each of them appeared to belong there, her posture and movement vocabulary shifting to match the ambient grammar of the place. She was training Issei in stillness because stillness was her weakest area, and she had observed early in his time at the valley that his primary deficit, and her primary deficit were different enough that teaching him might improve her own understanding. "You teach what you need to learn," she said one morning, when they were both sitting in the clearing and attempting to be absorbed by it. "Shirogane taught me this. When I arrived I was very fast and very reactive and completely unable to be still for longer than 20 seconds. The first student she assigned me was a tanuki who had survived a serious injury and needed to relearn patient observation. Teaching him, I learned it myself." "Did it work?" Issei asked. "I can now manage 4 minutes," she said. "Before you ask, no, that is not very long. Shirogane can manage 11 hours. I have not yet determined whether I am approaching that as a limit, or whether there is a technique I am still missing." Swerin was 31 and her specialty was what she called pharmaceutical architecture, which was her term for the construction of compound toxins that achieved effects unavailable to simple single-source venoms. A contact compound that produced confusion rather than paralysis. A trace aerosol that induced a specific kind of sensory disruption, the inability to correctly process spatial relationships, for a window of approximately 4 minutes. A compound that, when introduced to food or drink in a quantity that crossed no biological detection threshold, produced over the course of several weeks a gradual and increasing reluctance to engage in large group activities. "The last one is the interesting one," Issei said. "Yes," Swerin said. "An army that does not want to assemble is functionally different from an army that cannot assemble, but the operational result is similar, and the second is considerably harder to detect and respond to than the first." Ail was 28 and thought about space the way architects think about space, as something that could be designed to produce specific behaviors in the people who inhabited it. She had been applying her aerosol expertise to environments for the past 6 years, developing an understanding of how trace atmospheric compounds interacted with the ambient chemical signatures of inhabited places to produce effects that no single agent could accomplish alone. She was the most technically rigorous of the 12, maintaining detailed records of every intervention she had ever conducted in a collection of small notebooks with silk covers, and she had reviewed Issei's theoretical writing with the attention of a peer reviewer rather than a teacher. "Your framework for understanding power as information transfer is correct but incomplete," she told him at their first meeting. "You focus on the transfer itself. The channel. But the channel is a function of the environment through which it passes, and the environment is designable. If you control the environment, you can control what information transfers successfully, and what information does not. This is more foundational than anything you have written about. Can you teach me that?" he asked. "I can teach you to think about it correctly," she said. "Whether you can apply it depends on whether you develop the perceptual sensitivity to read environments accurately. That is Nagi's area." She looked at him with the analytical attention she seemed to bring to everything. "Nagi tells me you are improving." She does not tell many students that. Nagi herself was the quiet center of the 12's social structure, not in the sense of leadership, which was Shirogane's role without question, but in the sense of a weight that kept the structure balanced. She had been at the valley the longest of the younger generation, 40 years to Shirogane's several hundred, and she carried that tenure in the way of someone who had watched enough students arrive and leave and arrive again in different forms to have developed a comprehensive theory of learning that was both more patient and more demanding than any theory built on a shorter observation. The remaining 8 Issei learned more gradually, in the way that one learns the full dimensions of a place by living in it rather than being given a map. Rin, who specialized in the preservation and communication of information through dead drops and environmental marking, using a code system built on plant arrangement that had been in development for a century and a half. Kasumi, who had spent 15 years in human cities and understood urban supernatural geography with the intimacy of a native. Yuki, Hana, and Emi, who worked as a unit on what they called collective observation, the practice of maintaining surveillance on a target through distributed attention so diffuse that no individual observer was ever in a position that could be called watching. Tama and Ruri, the 2 eldest after Shirogane, who rarely spoke but whose presence in any room produced the sensation of being in a place where all the walls had been listening for a very long time, and Shirogane herself, who held all of it together through no visible mechanism that Issei could identify except the accumulated weight of understanding, the specific authority of someone who had seen enough of the world to have formed opinions about it that were not easily revised. First contact with the enemy's edge. The 6th week brought an unexpected development in the form of a visitor. Issei knew there was someone coming before they arrived because Yuki, Hana, and Emi had not been at breakfast, which had not happened once in the 6 weeks he had been at the valley, and because Keiro was spending her morning on the upper ridge rather than in the clearing, and because Shirogane had placed herself at the settlement entrance rather than in the common area, which Issei had learned was not her casual posture. He positioned himself in the interior of the storage building, which had a view of the entrance through a gap in the vine curtain, and he made himself as still as he could, which was not 4 minutes of Keiro-level stillness but was considerably better than it had been 6 weeks ago, and he waited. The visitor was a devil. Male, mid-tier by the feel of his power signature, wearing the kind of clothes that suggested access to money without a sophisticated understanding of how it was typically displayed. He had the particular bearing of someone who had spent a long time operating in environments where his supernatural status provided him with automatic authority, and had not developed any other kind of authority as a backup. He looked at Shirogane with the expectation of deference, and Shirogane looked back at him with the expression of someone observing weather. Elder Shirogane, he said, deploying the title as though it were a concession. The faction extends its continued appreciation for the valley's neutrality. The valley does not require the faction's appreciation, Shirogane said. But I note it. What is your purpose today? Information, he said. Routine information sharing. The faction wishes to know whether the valley has received any visitors in the past 2 months who might be characterized as agents of the 3 factions. Shirogane's expression did not change. The valley receives students of the traditional arts, she said. We do not ask our students to identify their affiliations. This has been our policy for 400 years, as you know, because your predecessors have asked the same question in the same form on approximately 17 prior occasions. The devil's composure developed a small fault line. The situation has changed. The faction has reason to believe that certain individuals are using the traditional arts communities as cover for intelligence operations. This would be a very inefficient form of intelligence operation, Shirogane said, given that the traditional arts require 3 to 6 months of committed study to achieve any level of competence. Spies tend to prefer shorter timelines. She paused. Is there anything else? He left. He left the way people leave when they have failed to obtain what they came for but are unwilling to acknowledge this directly, which is to say he left in the direction of the path but with a slight quality of lateral drift that suggested a desire to reconnoiter before departing. Yuki, Hana, and Emi, Issei was certain, were tracking him to the valley's edge. Shirogane came to find him in the storage building. She looked at the gap in the vine curtain through which he had been observing and then at him, and he had the experience that he had been having with some frequency recently, a feeling that he had been seen doing something that he had thought was invisible. Good, she said. I wasn't moving, he said. No. You were not. What did you observe? He was mid-tier but operating as if he were high-tier. Which means someone high-tier sent him as a routine check rather than coming themselves, which means the faction doesn't consider the valley a priority concern. They're doing maintenance surveillance rather than active investigation. And? He thought about it. The question about 2 months. That's a specific window. Something happened approximately 2 months ago that made them start asking about agents in traditional arts communities. If I can find out what that event was, I can understand what they're afraid of. What they're tracking. Yes, Shirogane said. Now you are thinking in the correct language. Chapter 4. The sentence takes shape. The exercise of invisible architecture. By the 8th week the training had shifted from component disciplines to integrated practice, and integrated practice meant that the individual lessons in stillness, in pharmaceutical knowledge, in environmental reading, and in the logic of strategic concealment were no longer separate subjects but aspects of a single continuous attention that he was being trained to sustain across multiple simultaneous channels. The exercise that Shirogane designed for this phase was simple in description and nearly impossible in execution. He was to move through the valley's outer perimeter, a circuit of approximately 3 kilometers, and arrive at each of 7 marked positions without being detected by the Lamia who were distributed throughout the perimeter on a schedule he did not know. Detection was defined as any of the following: visual acquisition of his person, detection of his power signature, or the triggering of any of the environmental markers that AO had placed throughout the route. Environmental markers that he had not been told the locations of, because that would have made the exercise a memory test rather than a perception test. He failed the first attempt comprehensively. He triggered 3 markers in the first kilometer, was detected visually by Keiro somewhere in the middle section, and was informed by AO on his return that he had passed through 2 aerosol-marked zones with detectable agitation in his movement pattern. How do you detect agitation in movement pattern through an aerosol? He asked. The compound interacts with exhaled breath and produces a trace signature, AO said. When someone is moving calmly, the signature is uniform. When someone is searching, it becomes irregular. You were searching for the markers. Of course I was searching for the markers. Yes. That is the lesson. Stop searching for the markers and simply move through the environment as though the environment is what it is. The markers will not harm you if you trigger them. They will simply record that you were thinking about them. The second attempt was worse because he was now thinking about not thinking about the markers, which produced a quality of self-consciousness in his movement that was apparently even more detectable than straightforward searching. AO delivered this assessment with the neutrality of a measuring instrument. The third attempt was conducted at night, which had not been part of the original exercise design but which Shirogane added without explanation, and it went substantially better. In the dark, without the visual input that his mind had been trying to use as the primary navigation channel, he settled into something more like the quality that Nagi had been trying to teach him, a distributed awareness that processed information from all sensory channels at roughly equal priority rather than forcing everything through vision. He moved more slowly. He stopped more often. He arrived at 5 of the 7 positions without any of the 3 detection criteria being triggered. Progress, Nagi said on the morning after. She was looking at him with the evaluative attention she always employed, and which he had long since stopped finding unsettling. You are beginning to listen with your body rather than your mind. It felt more like not listening at all, he said. Like I stopped trying to process information actively, and the information just arrived. Yes, she said. That is what listening feels like once you have learned to do it. Before that it feels like trying. After that it feels like not trying. Between the two, she paused, there is a great deal of failing. The compound. In the 10th week, Swearin and Ao sat down with him and talked about a compound that had no name in any language but which the 12 referred to in their own internal shorthand as the slow argument. It had been in development for 11 years. The theoretical framework had existed for longer, a consequence of Ao's research into environmental design and Swearin's pharmaceutical architecture converging on the same problem from different directions. But the technical execution had required 11 years of iterative refinement because the parameters were extremely specific and the margin of error was extremely small. What the compound was designed to do was this: introduced into an enclosed space that was regularly inhabited by a specific population, it would over a period of 6 to 8 weeks produce in that population a gradually increasing susceptibility to reconsidering foundational assumptions. Not a specific reconsideration. Not an instruction to think any particular thing. Simply a reduction in the cognitive resistance to updating beliefs in response to new information. You're describing something that makes people more rational, Issei said, which came out sounding more startled than he had intended. Not exactly, Swearin said. More open, rather than more rational. Rationality requires information and reasoning structures that we cannot provide. What the compound does is reduce the emotional cost of reconsidering. Most people who hold rigid beliefs are not holding them because they have evaluated the evidence and found it compelling. They are holding them because reconsidering is painful, and the pain prevents the evaluation from occurring. The compound reduces the pain, which means that if someone is in an environment treated with this compound and they encounter information that contradicts their foundational beliefs, they are more likely to actually process it rather than dismissing it reflexively, Issei said. Correct. And the old Satan faction has regular assembly points. Meeting halls, training facilities, administrative spaces where the same population returns repeatedly. Ao looked at Swearin. Swearin looked at Ao. They both looked at Issei. We have been thinking about how to introduce this compound to 3 specific locations for approximately 4 years, Ao said. We have not found an introduction vector that does not require either infiltration of the facility itself, or a sustained aerial approach that would be detectable. Infiltration, Issei said. The facilities have wards against supernatural intrusion, Swearin said. The wards do not distinguish between individual supernatural beings. Anything with a power signature above a human baseline triggers them. Issei thought about this. He thought about Nagi's lessons in the arithmetic of concealment, about the difference between eliminating a power signature and reducing it below a threshold. He thought about 11 weeks of learning to move through a space as though the space were primary and his presence were temporary. He thought about the power of the boosted gear, which could transfer, balance, and distribute, and which he had spent considerable time over the past year exploring as a tool for operations that had nothing to do with conventional combat. How sensitive are the wards? He said. Sufficiently sensitive to detect any being with an active gear, Swearin said. But an active gear is a specific signature. We do not know whether they are calibrated for passive gear signatures as well. I can put the gear in a state that feels passive, he said. It took me a while to learn how. It's not sustainable indefinitely, but it's sustainable for a reasonable operational window. Ao picked up one of her silk-covered notebooks and wrote something in it. Swearin did not move, but her attention shifted in the way that attention shifts when it has found a new direction to evaluate. The room was quiet in the way that the valley's rooms were often quiet, the specific quietness of people who understood silence as a form of speech and were currently saying something with it. We should speak to Shirogane, Ao said. Yes, Swearin agreed. They went to speak to Shirogane, and Issei followed, and what happened in the next 2 hours was the first meeting in his experience that felt less like a planning session and more like the construction of a very precise grammatical sentence in a language that he was only beginning to understand, with the understanding growing in him as the sentence took shape that this was what the past 10 weeks had been preparing him for. Not the combat application that most people would have assumed from a sacred gear carrier seeking unusual training, but this, the patient, meticulous, invisible architecture of a curriculum designed to be delivered to people who would not know they were receiving it. The ghost takes its shape. On the 83rd day of his training, Issei Hyoudou ran the perimeter exercise for the last time. He completed it in full dark, at 3/4 of normal pace, and arrived at all 7 positions without triggering any of the detection criteria. Keiro, who had been the most consistent observer of his progress, watched his return from her position in the upper branches of the black pine where she had first observed him passing through the valley, and she said nothing until he had reached the common area and she had dropped from the branch and approached him. I almost missed you at the 5th position, she said. I know, he said. I felt it. I stopped for a moment. Yes. That was the right response. She looked at him with the attention that had been evaluating him since the first day. You are not yet what Shirogane is. You are not yet what Tama or Ruri are. You will not be, because you were not raised in this, she paused, grammar. But you are something new. You are someone who has 2 grammars simultaneously. The grammar of force and the grammar of silence. Most beings have one. The few who have both are, she paused again, notable. Notably dangerous or notably useful? Issei asked. In my experience they tend to be both, she said. I recommend against separating the 2 categories. Shirogane received him in the common area at dawn, as she had received him on the first day, on the flat stone that had been worn smooth by centuries of the same use. The bark paper was on the table again. The notation system that he had been learning to read over the past weeks was visible in the low morning light, and he could now read enough of it to see that what was mapped was not geography but time. A sequence of interventions, a series of introductions, a curriculum arranged over months and years. Each element building on the previous one to produce in its recipients an experience that would change them without their being able to identify when or how the change had occurred. You are ready to carry the first element, Shirogane said. When? Not immediately. There is one more thing you require, and it cannot be taught in the valley. She looked at the bark paper and then at him. You need a reason to be in the spaces where the faction operates. A cover that is not cover, because cover that is only cover is detectable. A role that you genuinely occupy, that produces genuine reason for your presence in the locations we need accessed. You mean I need to be in the supernatural world in a capacity that gives me legitimate access to their facilities, he said. Yes. A capacity that they will not find suspicious because they will understand it as something other than what it is. He thought about this. He thought about the rating game world, about the circuits of competition and observation and social movement that it produced, about the way that a skilled participant in those games moved through layers of the supernatural world that were otherwise inaccessible without explicit invitation. Rating games, he said. Shirogane looked at him for a long moment. The faction has interests in the rating game system, she said. Administrative interests. They observe the games. They attend certain events. A competitor of sufficient profile would have access to those spaces. And a competitor who was also practicing the second grammar, Issei said, would have access to more than they could see. More than they could see, Shirogane agreed. This is the shape of the sentence. He left the valley on the 85th day, in the morning, carrying nothing that made sound. Keiro walked him to the edge of the tree cover and stopped there, her lower body invisible against the bark and root and shadow of the old forest, her dark eyes steady. The valley will know when you return, she said. Not if I've learned anything, he said. Something changed by a fraction of a degree in her expression. No, she said. Probably not. He walked out into the morning, and the forest closed behind him as though he had never been there at all, and somewhere in the trees Yuki and Hana and Emi watched the last trace of his passage until it was no longer readable, and Shirogane sat on the worn stone in the common area with the bark paper and began writing the next element of a sentence that would take years to complete. That would arrive in the minds of those who needed to receive it not as an argument but as an experience, not as a challenge but as a recognition of something they had always almost known, the specific and irreversible kind of knowledge that comes not from being told but from finding oneself already there. The valley settled back into its silence. The mist moved through the lower reaches of the forest in its patient way. The river ran clear and cold and carried nothing sinister in its current. The darkness was elsewhere now. Moving through the world at exactly the speed of someone who had learned to move like the world itself, carrying the first element of a sentence that the old Satan faction had no framework to expect and no dictionary to translate. Act 2. The Weight of Invisible Things. Chapter 5. The City Learns His Name. Re-entry. Kyoto in October was a city that had arranged itself to be looked at, which was why Issei liked it less than he once had. Beauty deployed for an audience was a different category of thing from beauty that existed because the conditions for it had been met, and no one had thought to do anything else. The valley had been the second kind. The curated temple walks and the photographed foliage, and the tour buses exhaling their loads of visitors onto carefully maintained gravel paths were the first. He moved through it the way he had learned to move through the valley perimeter, with his presence distributed rather than projected, his attention going out rather than in, reading the city as an environment that was continuously producing information about itself to anyone patient enough to receive it. He had been back for 11 days and he had spent those 11 days in the business of becoming, once again, a visible entity. Not the specific kind of visibility that the Lamia had taught him to deconstruct, but a different and deliberately constructed visibility. The visibility of a young devil-allied rating game competitor with notable potential and the particular kind of lateral ambition that could be read, by anyone examining him, as the clean competitive drive of someone who wanted to succeed within the existing system. This was the role that Shirogane had described in the abstract. Making it concrete was the work of these 11 days and of the considerable period ahead. The intermediary who managed his re-entry into the supernatural social circuits was a half-devil named Tomoya Serizawa who ran a small but well-regarded consultation practice from an office above a second-hand instrument shop in the Gion district. Serizawa's particular expertise was what he called social cartography, the mapping of relationships and obligations and influence debts in the supernatural world with enough accuracy that his clients could move through those relationships purposefully rather than being moved by them. He was 43, looked 28, and had the quality of someone who had decided at some point in the distant past that gathering information was more interesting than using it, and had subsequently accumulated enough of both to make the decision purely academic. You've been away, Serizawa said, not as a question. He was reviewing a small book of his own notes, cross-referencing something in it with a second book, not looking up. 3 months. The social geometry has shifted somewhat in that time. There are 3 new competitive pairings worth knowing about, 1 significant realignment of faction allegiance at the mid-tier level, and a development in the rating game administrative structure that will be relevant to your interests. Tell me about the administrative development, Issei said. Now Serizawa looked up. He had the habit, Issei had noticed, of evaluating questions for what they revealed about the person asking them rather than simply for their content. You've been gone 3 months and you're not asking about the competitive pairings. The competitive pairings will become apparent as I re-enter the circuit, Issei said. Administrative structures are harder to read from the inside. I'd rather know about them before I'm inside them. A pause. Serizawa set down the first book and picked up the second. The high-grade observer program, he said. It has been expanded. Previously, observers from outside the 3 main factions were permitted at upper bracket games on a case-by-case basis, with invitations extended by the game's hosting peerage. The new policy creates a standing observer class with credentials issued by the administrative body itself, which means observer access to certain facilities and events is now formalized rather than dependent on individual patronage. Who pushed for that expansion? The administrative body, officially. But the observation that several mid-tier competitors who had recently been approaching the upper bracket had patron connections to interests aligned with the conservative factions may be coincidental. Or may not be. Serizawa's expression conveyed that he considered the phrase may be coincidental to be among the more useful fictions available to professional conversation. The expansion makes it structurally easier for certain categories of observer to be present at events that were previously less accessible. Categories like individuals whose factions have an administrative interest in monitoring the progress of promising competitors. The faction, he used the word with the specific neutrality of someone who had long since catalogued the entities to which it might refer and selected the correct one from context, has increased its observer presence at rating game events in the past 6 months. Quietly. The increase is consistent with the administrative expansion but precedes it by approximately 4 months, which tells you something about whether the expansion was push or pull. Issei sat with this for a moment. Serizawa watched him sit with it, which was one of his more useful professional habits. I want to enter the upper bracket, Issei said. Fast enough to be notable but not so fast as to be suspicious. 4 months, Serizawa said. 3 wins at the competitive mid-tier level, the third of which should be against someone with existing upper bracket profile. That creates the narrative of ascent that the system recognizes as legitimate. It also, he added, with the tone of someone providing information rather than advice, puts you in the spaces where the administrative observer class tends to cluster. Good, Issei said. Let's build the 4 months. The first game, Kasahara House. The Kasahara peerage was everything that mid-tier rating game competition looked like from the outside. Well organized, technically competent, built around a central high-class devil of genuine but carefully managed ability who had constructed a team that minimized individual risk while maximizing collective output. Ryota Kasahara was 25, had been competing for 4 years, and had the specific kind of tactical intelligence that comes from studying the game rather than the world that the game was meant to approximate. He was good at rating games in the way that certain people are good at the test that is supposed to measure a skill without being particularly good at the underlying skill. Issei spent 2 weeks before the game doing nothing that looked like preparation. He attended social events in the circuits where the Kasahara peerage was known to circulate. He had 2 conversations with members of Kasahara's Rook over completely unrelated subjects. He visited the venue where the game was scheduled to be hosted, a constructed environment in the sub-dimensional space maintained by the administrative body, and he walked its perimeter in the capacity of an interested observer 3 days before the game, which was within the formal permissions available to registered competitors. He moved through it the way Nagi had taught him to move through spaces, as though the space were primary and his presence were temporary, receiving its characteristics rather than imposing his own on it. What he received from the venue was a thorough understanding of how Kasahara's team would use it. The terrain favored organized defensive positioning. The 3 elevated structures in the western quarter were natural concentration points for ranged pieces. The narrow approach corridors between the central cluster of constructed ruins and the eastern boundary created natural choke points that a team with Kasahara's configuration would find irresistible. It was not that Kasahara's strategy was predictable in the sense of being unsophisticated. It was that the strategy was well matched to a certain reading of the environment, and Issei's reading was different. He fielded his own peerage with instructions that seemed, to any external observer, inconsistent with sound tactical doctrine. His bishop opened aggressively in the center, which was immediately recognized by Kasahara's team as an overextension and responded to with the organized containment that the terrain supported. While that containment was in progress, his knight moved through the southern boundary's least surveilled approach in a route that Issei had mapped 3 days earlier, using the shadow of the elevated structures in the west to reduce the profile of the movement against the ambient light conditions of the sub-dimensional space. His rook, the most straightforwardly powerful piece in his current peerage, was not deployed at all for the first 40 minutes. At 41 minutes, Kasahara's team had successfully contained the bishop and was repositioning to consolidate the gain. At 42 minutes, the knight arrived at the eastern command position from the south, which was the direction from which arrival was structurally least expected, and removed Kasahara's queen from the game. At 43 minutes, the rook, who had been waiting in complete stillness in the sub-dimensional shadow of the largest ruin for the full 43 minutes, became visible to Kasahara's remaining pieces at a distance that made repositioning impractical. The game ended at 47 minutes. Kasahara came to find him afterward, in the brief social period that raiding game culture maintained after competitive events, with the determined hospitality of people who considered graciousness in defeat to be a professional requirement. He was composed and he was attentive, and the quality of his attention had shifted from the pre-game assessment of a competitor to the post-game assessment of someone trying to understand what had happened to him. "Your rook," he said. 43 minutes in that position. I had a standard detection sweep running the entire game. "I know," Issei said. "Your sweep used a standard or a threshold. My rook has been practicing reducing their signature below that threshold for about 2 months. It's sustainable for approximately 50 minutes before it becomes uncomfortable." Kasahara looked at him for a moment. "That's not in any of the current tactical literature," he said. "No," Issei agreed. "It's a new sentence." Kasahara did not appear to know what to do with this answer, which was, Issei thought, the correct response to a sentence delivered in a language you did not yet know you were hearing. The observer in the third row. The observer was there at the second game as well. Issei had been tracking him since the first game, where he had been present in the peripheral observer section of the administrative review gallery in a position that was technically unobtrusive and actually quite deliberate in its lines of sight. He was a devil of approximately high-tier adjacent status. Not high class in the formal sense, but close enough to carry the particular quality of someone who operated near the ceiling of mid-tier society, and was accustomed to being looked at. He did not look at Issei directly. He was consistently in positions from which looking directly would have required an obvious reorientation, which meant he had arranged his sight lines before the events he was observing began. Serizawa, when presented with a careful description, identified him as Oren Vale, an administrative coordinator attached to what the social cartographer called a conservative interest advisory body, in a tone that conveyed that these were not the words he would have selected if he were not in an office above a second-hand instrument shop that could potentially be observed from any of 3 adjacent buildings. "He attends games," Serizawa said. "He has been attending games at an increased rate for approximately 5 months. He is not affiliated with any competing peerage that I have documented. His attendance is consistent with the observer credential expansion, and he has not done anything that falls outside the formal permissions associated with that credential." "Who does he report to?" Serizawa set his books down and looked at Issei with the expression of someone who had been asked a question that they had the answer to and was in the process of deciding whether the context justified sharing it. "The organizational chart of the body he is affiliated with is not publicly available," he said carefully. "But the administrative body's observer credential program was, as I noted, expanded partly at the impetus of interests aligned with the conservative factions. If one were drawing an inference, one might infer that Veil represents a coordination function between the observer program and those interests. He's not just watching the games, Issei said. He's watching competitors. Building files. Identifying who among the rising mid-tier population would be sympathetic to a particular set of interests. That would be a reasonable inference, Sarazawa said, in the tone of someone washing his hands of the reasonable inference while noting its existence. Issei thought about what Shirogane had said about the relationship between visible power and invisible position. He thought about the faction's maintenance surveillance of the valley, the mid-tier devil who had arrived to ask routine questions and had been answered with the specific neutrality of an entity that had nothing to hide and no intention of helping. He thought about the fact that Veil was building files on rising competitors, which meant that Issei Hyoudou, if he continued ascending at the rate the 4-month plan required, would eventually become someone whose file Veil was actively developing. A file meant contact. Contact meant access to the spaces where the filing happened. He let this thought complete itself and then set it aside, because a thought that arrived too soon became a plan that executed prematurely, and premature execution was noise. Shirogane's word. He had been hearing it in the register that certain lessons occupy after they have been thoroughly absorbed, the register where the lesson is no longer a lesson but simply part of the way things are. Chapter 6. The Harem of Considered Allegiances. What a peerage is, and what it can be. The word harem carried a history that was not always the history people thought it was. In its oldest meaning it referred not to a collection of people arranged for anyone's benefit but to a designated sanctuary. A space that was defined by what it excluded rather than by what it contained. The Arabic root meant something that was forbidden to trespass, not the people inside but the threshold itself, the principle of protected interior. Issei had looked this up at some point during his years in the raiding game system and had found it clarifying in a way that the conventional usage of the word never quite managed to be. He thought about it now because the peerage he was building was, in the most operational sense, a sanctuary. A protected interior from which work could be done that the exterior was not equipped to understand. Himari was the first. She was a Joragumo, a spider-type yukai, 22 years old in the human reckoning and considerably older in her own, which operated on a different scale. She had come to him through Kasumi, the valley Lamia who had spent 15 years in urban supernatural geography and who had, it turned out, a network of contacts in the yukai communities of several major cities that she had maintained with the patient consistency of someone who understood that a network is a living thing and dies without regular attention. Kasumi had described Himari as someone worth knowing, which in Kasumi's precise vocabulary was a specific assessment rather than a general commendation. She was worth knowing because she thought about webs the way Issei had been learning to think about environments, as design spaces, as information structures, as systems whose architecture determined what could move through them, and what could not. Her literal webs, the silk thread constructions that she maintained in the spaces she inhabited, were also listening instruments, subtle enough to be invisible to casual supernatural detection and sensitive enough to register the passage of beings through adjacent spaces without direct contact. She had been living in Osaka for 6 years and she knew the supernatural geography of 3 wards and the kind of depth that came from sustained, patient, distributed observation. "You are not building a standard peerage," she said, at their second meeting. She had a quality of directness that was not aggressive but was extremely thorough, the directness of someone who had learned over a long time that indirectness was more expensive than it appeared. "You are building something that looks like a standard peerage from the outside." "Yes," Issei said. "And the something that it actually is?" "A collective attention," he said. "Multiple complementary observation and intervention capacities operating from a position that the rating game system makes formally legitimate." She sat with this for a moment, her human hands folded in her lap in the particular stillness of someone who had a great deal of patience for silence, and was using it. Intervention meaning? Meaning the introduction of specific information into specific environments to produce specific experiences in specific populations. Not combat. Not primarily. The rating game covers the combat when that's what the circuit requires. Everything else is the other work. She looked at him for a long time. Joragumo of her age and experience had a quality of evaluation that was different from the Lamias, where the Lamia evaluated through stillness, Through the patience of something that had time, Himari evaluated through the complete engagement of her attention in a way that felt less like being assessed and more like being mapped. When she was done, she said, "I have been waiting for several years for something worth doing. What you are describing may be that." "Maybe? I will determine the answer to that question by doing it," she said. "This is the only reliable method. Yua and the practice of honest deception." The second was Yua, who was the daughter of a minor Tanuki family from the Nara area and who had been practicing shape-shifting since she was old enough to understand that the world responded differently to different forms, which for a Tanuki was approximately age 4. She was not the most powerful shapeshifter Issei had encountered in his time in the supernatural world, but she was the most precise, and the distinction mattered in the way that the distinction between a speaker with a large vocabulary and a speaker with exact vocabulary matters in a context where a single wrong word can change the meaning of a sentence entirely. Her specialty was what she called honest deception, the practice of presenting a form that was not her natural form but that was entirely genuine in the sense that it was fully inhabited, not worn but occupied, not a costume but an expression of some actual aspect of herself that her natural form happened not to foreground. She had 7 such forms that she maintained as fully developed identities, different ages, different apparent species, different social classes, each of them equipped with the entire infrastructure of a person, histories and habits and preferences and the specific texture of someone who has always been exactly as they appear. These were not disguises. They were, she explained, the parts of herself that happen to require different bodies to be visible. Most shapeshifters get detected because they're wearing something, she said. She was in her natural form for this conversation, which was a young woman of about 20 with the characteristic Tanuki coloring and the faint sense of warmth that Tanuki emanated in close quarters, the specific thermal signature of an entity that found the world generally interesting. They inhabit the form just enough to pass casual observation, but the inhabitation is shallow, and deep scanning finds the edges of it. But if the form is a genuine expression rather than a layer on top of a genuine expression, Issei said, there are no edges to find. Exactly. The scan looks for discontinuity between surface and interior. If there is no discontinuity, the skin finds nothing suspicious. She paused. This took me 8 years to develop. I practiced each form for approximately a year before I was satisfied that it was genuinely mine rather than something I was wearing. 8 years is a significant investment, he said. The world is full of people who invested less and were subsequently detected, she said. I found the comparison instructive. She had come to him through a different intermediary, one of Sarazawa's contacts in the mid-tier social circuits, and she had arrived at their first meeting already in possession of enough information about his general activity to make the early part of the conversation unnecessary, which he found more impressive than alarming. Her intelligence sources were apparently thorough. What I want to know, she said, at that first meeting, is whether what you're doing will actually work. I don't know yet, he said, which surprised her. Most people in your position would tell me it will work, she said. Most people in my position haven't thought carefully about what working looks like for an operation that unfolds over years and whose success is measured in changes to how people think rather than in territory captured or enemies defeated. I have thought about it carefully. The honest answer is that I believe the approach is sound and the execution is the question. And I won't know the quality of the execution until I've executed enough of it to have feedback. She looked at him for a long moment. That, she said, is the most honest assessment I have received from a prospective employer in my entire professional life. Is it sufficient? It is more than sufficient, she said. Honest uncertainty is considerably more useful than confident misinformation. I would rather build on correct foundations than on comfortable fictions. The others and their particular knowledges. The peerage assembled over the following 6 weeks in a process that looked, from the outside, exactly like the normal assembly process of a competitive rating game peerage, a young high-class devil identifying candidates, conducting meetings, making offers, accepting or declining based on the standard criteria of complementary abilities and mutual compatibility. The social circuits of mid-tier devil society generated a small amount of interest and a moderate amount of speculation, both of which were normal components of the process, and neither of which came near the actual basis on which he was making decisions. Ren was a half-phoenix, which meant her regenerative capacity was not just physical but extended to certain categories of information. She could reconstruct, from the residual traces left in a space, the recent history of what had occurred there. This was not a common ability, and it was not well understood by most practitioners of supernatural combat, which meant it was not well defended against. Spaces that had been cleared with standard information suppression wards retained enough trace for Rin to read, because the standard wards operated on active information signatures and she read passive residue. She was 24 and she had been using this ability, before Issei found her, primarily to assist with property disputes in the supernatural community, which was both a less interesting application than what he had in mind and a considerably safer one. I am aware that what you're asking me to do is not property dispute resolution, she said, at their second meeting. No, he confirmed. The residue reading in an actively occupied faction facility would be, she paused, calculating something internally, considerably more complex than my current case load. The density of event trace in a frequently used space is the equivalent of trying to read a single document that has been written over by 50 other documents in sequence. The signal-to-noise ratio is very poor. Could you improve it with preparation? With time in the space, yes. The longer I spend in a location, the better I can calibrate my reading to its specific residue patterns. The noise becomes familiar and separable from the signal. She looked at him. How long would I have in a given location? Depends on the operational context. Potentially multiple visits over a period of weeks. Multiple visits, she said slowly. That suggests a cover that provides legitimate re-entry. Not a one-time infiltration. Correct. She thought about this. Property dispute resolution is very boring, she said eventually. I have been doing it for 2 years. I am good at it, and it is very boring. What I'm proposing is not boring. No, she agreed. It is the opposite of boring. I will need to think about it. She thought about it for 3 days and then contacted him to say she had decided, and that the deciding factor had been the realization that she had developed her ability to its current level through application, and that the application available to her in her current situation had reached its ceiling, and that she was not ready to stop learning. Mio came from a family of kitsune who had been operating at the edge of the mid-tier supernatural world for 4 generations, maintaining the specific kind of institutional knowledge that accumulates in families that have been navigating a particular social environment for long enough to have developed theories about it. Her specialty was communication, not just the transmission of information but its packaging, the art of presenting accurate information in a form that would be received and retained by the specific recipient rather than dismissed or misfiled by the recipient's existing categorical frameworks. She was a student of what she called the rhetoric of the true, which was her term for the practice of making real things sound real to people who had reasons to disbelieve them. Most people who deal in accurate information assume that the accuracy is its own recommendation, she said, in the way of someone who had been explaining this for years to people who continued not to understand it. They present the true thing and are surprised when it is not accepted. They conclude that the recipient is irrational. This diagnosis is sometimes correct but is less useful than the alternative diagnosis, which is that the packaging was wrong. And the packaging is the part that can be designed, Issei said. Yes. The information itself is fixed. But the frame, the context, the relationship between the recipient and the source, the moment of delivery, the medium, all of these are variables. Get them right and accurate information is accepted. Get them wrong and it is rejected regardless of its accuracy. That's what I need, he said. When the time comes to deliver information to specific members of the faction, the information will be accurate. The packaging is the work. Mio looked at him with the evaluative attention of someone who had just been given a specific and sufficiently interesting problem. What kind of information? The kind that shows people that the doctrine they have been living inside is not being lived by the people who constructed it. A pause. That's delicate packaging, she said. I know. Done wrong, it produces a defensive reaction that makes the target less open to the information than they were before receiving it. Done right, it produces a recognition that was already forming and simply needed to complete itself. And you know the difference between wrong and right in this context. I have been studying it for 8 years, she said. I know the difference better than anyone I have met. The last 2 were Shiro and Natsuki, who came as a unit and would not be separated, which Issei had no intention of requesting because the unit was the point. Shiro was a wolf-type Hyukai whose primary ability was not the combat orientation that wolf-type was usually associated with but a navigational sense so precise that it extended beyond physical geography into what she called social topography, the invisible landscape of relationship and allegiance and obligation that shaped how supernatural beings moved through their communities and made decisions within them. Natsuki was an Itako, a spirit medium of the traditional type, which in the supernatural world meant not a theatrical performer but someone with a genuine and specific access to the information retained by the deceased, the residual knowledge structures that persisted after death in the particular medium that spirits occupied. Together, Shiro's mapping of the living social landscape and Natsuki's reading of the historical one produced a combined picture of any environment they studied that was difficult to obtain through any other means, not just how things were now, but how they had become that way. The choices and events and relationships that had accumulated to produce the present configuration, and that therefore shaped what kinds of change were possible, and what kinds were not. Most strategies fail because they do not account for the historical weight of what they're trying to change, Shiro said, in their first meeting. She was calm in the way of things that do not need to be agitated because they are already exactly as fast as they need to be. They identify the present configuration and try to change it without understanding why it is what it is. The why determines what kinds of pressure are effective, and what kinds simply compress it into a different shape that reasserts itself. And understanding the why requires Natsuki's part of the picture, Issei said. Understanding the why requires both parts, Natsuki said. She was quieter than Shiro, her attention turned slightly inward in the way of someone who was always partly elsewhere. The living configuration and the historical accumulation are not separate things. One is the residue of the other. Like Ren's residue reading, but for organizational structures rather than physical spaces. They looked at each other briefly, a communication too compact to be parsed by an observer. We should meet Ren, Shiro said. Chapter 7, The Administrative Interior. The third game and what followed it. The third game was against Iori Kosaka, who was everything that the Kasuhara game had not been, a high-profile competitor with 7 years of upper-bracket experience who had stepped down to the competitive mid-tier for a single season for reasons that the social circuits described as personal and that Sarazawa, with his characteristic restraint, described as administratively complex. She had a complete tactical vocabulary and the specific intuition that comes from having been in enough high-stakes games to have developed a theory of competitive behavior rather than just a collection of tactical responses. She also, Mio determined through 6 days of careful social circuit observation, had a relationship with the faction's observer presence in the rating game system that was not formal but was not accidental, several meetings in contexts that were socially plausible but strategically interesting, a shared history with Oren Vale that predated the current observer expansion by 2 years. She's not an agent, Mio said. She was precise about language in the way of someone for whom language was the primary professional instrument. She's a person of established profile whose presence in a game against a rising competitor creates a legitimate narrative reason for the observer presence to increase its attention on the rising competitor. Win or lose, after a game against Kosaka, you become someone that Vale has formal reason to file extensively. Which is exactly what we want, Issei said. Yes. But Kosaka is also genuinely good, Mio said. The legitimate narrative requires that the game be credible. If you win too easily, the narrative becomes about your rapid ascent rather than about the game itself, and that draws a different kind of attention. Administrative attention rather than observer attention. The difference being? Observer attention is Vale's job. Administrative attention is his supervisor's job, and his supervisor's interest in promising competitors is not the same as Vale's. The supervisor is interested in acquisition rather than observation. Recruitment, Issei said? Yes. And recruitment brings you inside in a way that is harder to manage than observation. You want Vale's file. You do not yet want his supervisor's proposal. He thought about this. So the game needs to be a genuine contest. The game needs to look like a genuine contest in which you demonstrate qualities that are notable but that read as the qualities of a serious competitor rather than the qualities of someone exceptional enough to acquire immediately. Notable ambition. Technical sophistication. A capacity for strategic innovation that is developing rather than fully formed. You want me to lose. I want you to lose in a way that is also a win, Mio said. The narrative of a genuine contest, well fought, against an experienced competitor, from which you emerge with reputation enhanced despite the defeat, is more useful at this stage than the narrative of an easy victory. Kasaka winning against you gives Vale's file a complexity that makes it more interesting to him. Interesting files receive more sustained attention. Sustained attention creates more contact. He looked at her for a moment. You have been thinking about packaging for a long time. Since I was 12, she confirmed. It is a comprehensive education. The game against Kasaka lasted 2 hours and 14 minutes, which was longer than any game Issei had previously competed in. It was, by the assessment of the observers and commentators in the administrative gallery, the most technically interesting mid-tier game of the current season. Kasaka won by 3 pieces, the minimum margin of her full tactical vocabulary against the developing but genuine sophistication of his. The game ended in a way that left no one in the gallery with any doubt that the margin had been close, that it had been earned, and that the competitor who had lost it was someone worth continued attention. Afterward, Kasaka shook his hand with the genuine respect of someone who had expected an easy game and had received something considerably more demanding, and Oren Vale, in the 3rd row of the observer section, wrote something in a notebook that he kept in his interior breast pocket, and the entry was, Issei was certain, longer than any he had written at a game before. The file opens. Contact came 8 days after the game. It came through the standard intermediary channels that the administrative observer class used for what it called informal outreach, which was its phrase for the period of relationship building that preceded any formal proposal. The intermediary was a woman named Shizue who managed a consulting practice that nominally served the mid-to rating game community, and actually served as one of several social interfaces between the observer class and the competitor population it monitored. She was pleasant in the professional manner of someone whose pleasantness was a tool, and she was good at her job in the way that made the fact of her being good at it the last thing you noticed. Issei met her at a restaurant in the Shinjuku district on a Tuesday afternoon. He brought Yua, who was currently occupying the form of a quiet young woman from a minor devil family with a reputation for administrative work, and who sat 3 tables away and heard every word of the conversation through an instrument that was not electronic but that functioned on similar principles. You had an impressive showing against Kasaka, Shizue said, over tea that she did not drink. The community noticed. There are several parties with an interest in what you develop into. I appreciate the interest, Issei said. He was calibrating his manner carefully, open to engagement, modestly ambitious, slightly flattered, the specific combination that Mio had described as the appropriate response at this stage of the contact protocol. I'm focused on the circuit right now. Building the peerage, developing the approach. Of course, Shizue said. The circuit is exactly where you should be. But it's useful, at your stage, to be aware of the broader landscape. The people who do well in the rating game system over the long term are usually the ones who understood early that the game exists within a larger set of relationships, and that those relationships shape what the game makes possible. This was the introduction. Issei recognized it as an introduction because Mio had described it to him in advance, almost word for word, as the standard framing that the observer class used to open conversations about alignment. The suggestion that the game was a subset of something larger, that the something larger was navigable with the right guidance, that the guidance was available through the relationship being initiated. That's a framework I've been thinking about, he said. The game as a window onto the larger structure rather than the structure itself. Shizue's professional pleasantness developed a quality of increased attention that was still pleasantness but was now doing slightly more work. Exactly. There are people who would be very interested in having that conversation with you more formally. I'd be open to that, Issei said. In the right context, of course. No pressure and no timelines. She finally picked up the tea. Just a conversation among people with shared interests in understanding the landscape. After she left, Yua returned to the table and sat down and looked at him with the evaluative attention she brought to everything. She has this conversation frequently, she said. The phrasing was very practiced. It is a script with variables. Yes, he said. The next step in the script is an invitation to a small informal event. something that appears social. Attendees who are all in some stage of the contact protocol. It functions as a mutual evaluation. They assess the candidates, and the candidates, if they're paying attention, assess the space. Good, he said. That's the space Ao and Swear need. Yua looked at him. You have been planning for the invitation since before the contact happened. Since before the Kasaka game, he said. The contact was the predictable result of the game. The game was designed to produce the contact. She was quiet for a moment. Most people who play at this level play it turn by turn, she said. They respond to what happens. You are playing several moves ahead. I had a good teacher, he said. Several good teachers. They are very patient and their scales are very beautiful, and they live in a valley that does not appear on any map. Yua looked at him for one more moment, and then something in her face shifted in the warm way that her face shifted when it found something genuinely interesting, and she poured more tea into his cup and they sat in the restaurant in the afternoon light and planned the next move in a sentence that was gradually acquiring the specific weight of a thing that would, when complete, be very difficult to answer. Chapter 8. The First Element. The Event and Its Architecture. The invitation arrived 10 days later, as Yua had predicted, in the form of a handwritten card delivered by a messenger to his registered address in the Rating Game Administrative Directory. The card invited him to a private gathering of professionals with shared interests in the development of supernatural governance frameworks, to be held at a location in the Minato ward of Tokyo that Shiro identified, within 4 hours of the invitation's receipt. As a property registered to a holding company with organizational links to the conservative interests advisory body that Sarazawa had described when naming Vale. The gathering was scheduled for a Friday evening, and was described as informal. Issei spent the 4 days between invitation and event in a state of activity that appeared, to any external observer, like the normal preparation of a young competitor for an important social engagement, appropriate clothing selected, background reading on the likely attendees conducted through standard channels. The kind of practice self-presentation refined that social events in the supernatural community required of anyone who wished to be taken seriously rather than merely noted. What was actually happening was more layered. Himari had been in the Minato ward for 3 days, having traveled there in the form that was her natural form rather than any of the constructed ones because her natural form was the one that was most effectively invisible in urban supernatural geography. She looked entirely human, moved with the ease of someone who had been in cities for a long time. And the web structures she maintained in inhabited spaces were thin enough and positioned carefully enough that they registered as entirely consistent with the ambient arachnid presence of any Tokyo building. She had mapped the property from the outside and from 3 adjacent positions, establishing the access routes, the internal topology as far as it was readable from external positioning, and the patterns of activity in the 48 hours before the event. Ren had been inside the property once, 4 days before the event, in the capacity of a delivery contractor through a channel that Yua had arranged through one of her identities. The visit had lasted 11 minutes, which was long enough for her to begin the calibration process that would allow her, on subsequent visits if they could be arranged, to read the residue of the space with increasing accuracy. 11 minutes was not enough for a complete reading, but it was enough to establish a baseline and to confirm that the space had been used for the kind of regular gathering that left the dense, layered residue of repeated significant conversations. Ao had prepared the first element. It was a version of the slow argument adapted for the specific environment that Himari's external observation and Ren's interior baseline had described, a property with a particular ventilation pattern, a particular circulation of air through the spaces most likely to be used for the gathering, a particular ambient humidity that affected the dispersal dynamics of the compound in specific ways. Ao had spent 2 days refining the formulation for these specific conditions, consulting with Swearin through a communication channel maintained through Rin's dead drop system, and the result was a quantity of compound small enough to fit in a sealed vial no larger than a standard laboratory sample container. The delivery mechanism was Issei himself. The vial was not carried in any pocket or container. It was incorporated into the lining of his jacket at a position that placed it within reach of his left hand through a motion indistinguishable from adjusting the jacket's fit, a motion he had practiced sufficiently that it was no longer something he thought about doing. The release mechanism was a pressure point that broke the seal and allowed the compound to disperse into the immediate environment in a quantity consistent with AO's calculations, enough to treat the primary gathering space within approximately 15 minutes. Undetectable by standard supernatural scanning because its signature fell below the detection threshold of every ward type that Himari's observation had identified as active on the property. You understand, Shirogane had said, in one of their final conversations at the Valley, that this is not the end of anything. The compound does not change people. It creates a condition in which change is more possible. The change requires the information to arrive, and the information arriving requires the packaging, and the packaging requires time and positioning and the subsequent elements that we have not yet prepared. I understand, Issei had said. We're planting a garden. This is the soil preparation. Yes, she had said. Gardeners who are impatient with soil preparation tend to produce gardens that fail at the moment they should be thriving. Do not be impatient. 20 faces in a room. There were 23 people at the gathering, not counting the staff. Issei arrived at the recommended time, which he had calculated was the time that would produce the maximum social coverage in the pre-dinner period without arriving early enough to be the person who arrived first, and without arriving late enough to have missed the natural formation of the social groupings that would tell him who was central and who was peripheral. Vale was there, moving through the room with the practiced ease of someone who had organized this kind of event many times and was now performing attendee rather than host in a way that was technically accurate and socially transparent to anyone who was paying the right kind of attention. He greeted Issei with the particular warmth of someone who knew more about you than the conversation had yet established, which was a specific social signal that Mio had identified as Vale's standard approach to candidates. He had already filed extensively. Good to finally speak directly, Vale said. He had the voice of someone who spent a lot of time in rooms where voices mattered and had invested accordingly. I've been following your development in the circuit with considerable interest. I noticed, Issei said, which caused a brief recalibration in Vale's expression before it resettled into the practiced warmth. Mio had told him to acknowledge awareness of the observation early. It signaled confidence, removed the fiction that the observation had been undetected, and moved the conversation immediately to a more honest register that Vale, who was professionally sophisticated, would find more interesting than the standard performance of ignorance. Good, Vale said after a moment. I dislike pretense. You've been playing a careful game. The Kasaka match in particular was instructive. She's excellent, Issei said. The loss was a useful education. All genuine contests are, Vale agreed. The results matter less than the learning. People who care only about the results tend to plateau. They've spent all their resources on the outcome rather than on the understanding. This was true, and Issei agreed with it genuinely, and the genuineness of the agreement was apparent in his response, and the apparent genuineness was useful because it was not performed. He had long since learned that the most effective communications were the ones where the thing being communicated was actually true, because the texture of truth was unmistakably different from the texture of performance, and sophisticated listeners knew the difference. The gathering moved through its natural phases. Issei moved through the room in a pattern that Shiro had helped him design, a circuit that covered the maximum number of meaningful conversations without appearing calculated, pausing at the positions that Himari had identified as the natural centers of the social geography, engaging with the attendees who represented the nodes of the network rather than its periphery. He was present without being prominent, engaged without being eager, showing exactly the qualities that Mio had specified as appropriate for this stage, someone worth continued investment but not yet fully legible. At some point in the first hour, while adjusting the fit of his jacket in a motion he had practiced sufficiently that it required no thought, he released the compound. The room did not change. Nothing visible happened. The conversations continued. The wine circulated. Vale moved through the gathering with his practiced warmth, and the other attendees occupied their social positions with the ease of people who had been in rooms like this before. 14 minutes later, Issei noticed a quality of attention in the room that was slightly different from its baseline. Not dramatically different. Not different in any way that a casual observer would register as meaningful. But he had spent 3 months in a valley learning to read environmental atmospheres with the distributed attention that Nagi had taught him, and the difference was perceptible to him in the same way that a change in wind direction is perceptible to someone who has been standing in the same outdoor space for long enough to know its normal pattern. The conversations had not changed in topic or in tone, but the quality of listening in them had shifted, very slightly, toward a register he recognized. The register of people who are genuinely receiving what is being said to them rather than preparing their response while the other person speaks. The register of slightly lowered cognitive defenses, slightly increased presence, slightly more available attention. The soil was prepared. What happened next would take months. The information would need to arrive in the right forms at the right moments through the right channels, and the people in this room who were worth reaching would need to encounter it in the conditions that allowed for genuine reception rather than reflexive rejection. Mio would design the packaging. Ren would read the residue to tell them what conversations had already occurred in this space. Shiro and Natsuki would map the historical weight of each individual's relationship to the doctrine they had been living inside. Himari's web would track the movement of information through the network, identifying which nodes were transmitting and which were receiving, where the architecture of belief was solid and where it had already begun to develop the hairline fractures that preceded genuine reconsideration. Issei stayed at the gathering for 2.5 hours. He left at a time that appeared natural rather than calculated, saying his goodbyes with the warmth of someone who had genuinely enjoyed the evening, which was not entirely untrue. He was capable of being genuinely interested in people even while also doing other things, and several of the conversations had been genuinely interesting. Vale stopped him near the door. "We should continue the conversation," he said. "I'd like that," Issei said, and he meant it. The conversation with Vale was not a cover. It was the work itself, the patient building of a relationship that would eventually place Issei in the rooms and spaces that the sentence required him to be in, carrying the subsequent elements toward the people who needed to receive them, in the packaging that Mio would construct from the residue that Rin read and the topography that Shiro mapped and the history that Natsuki recovered from the air where it had been waiting to be heard. Chapter 9. The Long Game's Second Move. What the residue said? Ren's second visit to the property occurred 6 weeks after the gathering, facilitated by a social engagement that Vale's continued relationship building with Issei had naturally produced. A smaller meeting, for people, in a side room of the same property, which was apparently used on a rotating basis for a variety of gatherings in the mid-tier supernatural social circuit. The meeting was about rating game strategy and was entirely genuine in its content. 2 hours of the kind of sophisticated competitive analysis that Issei had genuinely been pursuing for long enough that he could conduct it without any layer of performance. Ren arrived 20 minutes before him, in the capacity of a contractor delivering materials to the property's kitchen, and spent 11 minutes in the gathering room calibrating her baseline reading. By the time Issei arrived for the meeting, she was 3 blocks away, in a cafe with silk curtains in the window, drinking coffee and reading the beginning of what the residue had left her. Her report arrived through Rin's dead drop system 48 hours later, and Issei read it in the small room above the stationery shop in Kyoto, which he had maintained as his base of operations because it was unremarkable and because the stationer, an elderly human woman named Matsuda who had been renting to supernatural community members for 30 years without asking questions, was the kind of landlord who understood that her tenant's privacy was a professional matter. The report was in Ren's precise handwriting, which was the handwriting of someone who had spent years recording observations with the understanding that the observations needed to be accurate because they could not be repeated. It covered 6 pages and described, in the layered and complex vocabulary of residue reading, the accumulated history of the gathering room as best she could reconstruct it from 4 visits at approximately 2-week intervals. 3 things in the report were significant. The first was that the room had been used for what she described as instruction sessions on 7 occasions in the past 4 months. Instruction in the residue reading sense, one voice doing the majority of the talking, the ambient signatures of the other occupants showing the specific pattern of people receiving information rather than exchanging it. The content of the instruction was not recoverable from residue alone, but the pattern of who had been in the room for which sessions was recoverable from the directional signatures, and the pattern showed that the sessions were not random but organized, a core group of 6 to 8 individuals who attended all or most of them, a rotating outer group of 12 to 15 who attended 1 or 2. The second was that 3 individuals had been in the room at the gathering in the first week of the previous month whose power signatures she cross-referenced with Shiro's social topography map, and identified as mid-ranking administrative figures from inside the faction's organizational structure. Not the observer class. The organizational structure itself. They had not been at the gathering that Issei had attended, which meant there was a separate gathering that she had not previously known about. The third was that the compound AO had introduced at the first gathering had not fully dispersed. A trace remained in the ventilation system, at a concentration below the therapeutic threshold but consistent with the kind of accumulation that AO had described as a secondary effect of the formulation in enclosed spaces with specific circulation patterns. The ventilation was moving the trace through the entire building at a rate that, by AO's calculations when Issei relayed this finding, would produce a property-wide ambient concentration approaching the threshold level within approximately another 3 months. That was not the intention, AO said, when he relayed the finding through the communication channel. A pause that, even through the written medium of the dead drop system, carried the specific quality of a technically rigorous person reconsidering a model. But it is not necessarily a problem. A property-wide ambient at sub-threshold concentration would affect the sessions you did not know about as well as the ones you do. The instruction sessions, Issei said. If the instruction involves the kind of content that benefits from reduced cognitive resistance to reconsideration, AO said carefully, then a sub-threshold ambient concentration in the room where that instruction occurs may produce gradual effects over an extended period that are not achievable with a single threshold level treatment. The effect curve is different, but the aggregate outcome may be comparable or superior. You're saying the accident may be better than the plan. Another pause. I am saying the accident is a phenomenon worth studying. I will revise the model to account for it. Do not treat it as a reliable outcome until I have more data. He told Rin to prioritize her subsequent visits to the property around the instruction sessions, which Shiro's ongoing social topography work had now identified as occurring on a roughly bi-weekly cycle. The calibration of Ren's reading was improving with each visit. The noise of the dense accumulated residue was becoming increasingly separable from the signal, and what the signal was beginning to say, in the partial and fragmentary way of things that were not yet complete enough to interpret confidently, was that the content of the instruction was not purely tactical or administrative. It was doctrinal. Natsuki reads the air. Natsuki entered the property for the first time on a Thursday morning in November, in the form that Yua had constructed for her over 2 weeks of careful work. A mid-tier devil from a minor administrative family with legitimate business at the property's consulting arm, carrying a document portfolio that contained actual documents relating to actual administrative matters that the cover identity had actual standing to present. The visit lasted 40 minutes. She spent 22 of those minutes in the gathering room on the pretext of waiting for her appointment. What Natsuki read in those 22 minutes was not residue in Ren's sense, not the chemical and energetic traces of past events, but something she described as the atmospheric accumulation of intention, the record kept by the space itself of the emotional and motivational weight of the things that had been decided in it, the purposes that had been formed, the commitments that had been made. Where Rin read the what of the past, Natsuki read the why and the who inside. Her report, delivered through the dead drop 4 days later, was the most unsettling document Issei had read since he began the operation. The gathering room had been the site of, by her accounting, 14 decision-making sessions in the past 8 months at which commitments had been formed that she characterized as follows: 3 sessions producing what she called binding commitments, the kind made by people who understand they are crossing a threshold and accept the consequences of the crossing. 6 sessions producing what she called instrumental commitments, the kind made by people who are doing what their role requires and are not fully investing their own conviction in the doing, and 5 sessions producing what she called fragile commitments, the kind made by people who are going through the forms of commitment because the social cost of not doing so exceeds the social cost of the commitment itself, but who have not, in the interior of their own understanding, actually committed. 5 fragile commitments, Issei said to Mio, when they reviewed the report together. In that room alone, Mio said. She was reading the report with the attention of someone who was simultaneously processing its content and developing its implications. And the fragile commitments, in a doctrinal context, are exactly where the packaging can work. People who are genuinely committed to a doctrine are resistant to information that contradicts it because the commitment is integral to their identity. People who are going through the forms of commitment are much more available to information that provides a permission structure to stop going through the forms. The permission structure being evidence that the people at the center are also going through the forms, Issei said. Yes. Not arguments that the doctrine is wrong. Arguments are evaluable and can be rejected. Evidence that the people they respect and fear and follow are not believers themselves is something different. It produces not an argument but a recognition. And recognition, she said in the tone of someone who had spent 8 years understanding this, does not require acceptance. It simply requires arrival. He thought about this. He thought about the 5 people in that room who had made fragile commitments, whose names Shiro was in the process of identifying through her social topography work, whose histories Natsuki was continuing to read from the accumulated atmosphere of the spaces they had passed through. He thought about the distance between where they currently were and where the information they needed to receive would find them if it arrived in the right packaging through the right channel at the right moment. The distance was not small. The operation was months old and it was still, by any honest accounting, in its earliest stages. The soil preparation was complete. The first element had been introduced. The mapping was ongoing and the picture was becoming more legible with each iteration. But the sentence was not yet written. The words were being assembled, the grammar was being confirmed, the spacing between clauses was being measured, and the full meaning of what was being composed would not be visible until considerably more of it existed. Shirogane had warned him about this. She had warned him because she had seen it before. The student who learns patience as a concept, and then mistakes the concept for the practice, who can articulate the virtue of slowness while being in fact impatient, who plans long games and then plays them quickly. The warning had been delivered without judgment, in the matter-of-fact register of someone reporting a common failure mode, and Issei had received it in the same register, accepting its accuracy about the likely shape of his challenge. He sat with the report and the analysis and the incomplete picture of the operation's progress, and practiced the thing that was the hardest thing to practice, doing nothing with it yet. Reading it, understanding it, updating his model, and setting it aside until the next piece arrived, because acting on an incomplete picture was the most reliable way to ruin the picture. Vale asks a question. Their fourth meeting occurred at a restaurant in Roppongi that Vale had chosen, which told Issei several things about how the relationship was being managed on Vale's end. The location was neutral ground, expensive but not ostentatious, the kind of place that communicated seriousness without formality and that was routinely used by the mid-tier supernatural community for conversations that were important without being official. The conversation moved through its first phase in the established pattern, rating game discussion, competitive analysis, the kind of exchange of professional perspective that was genuine on Issei's side and partly genuine on Vale's, who was engaged enough in the subject matter to have formed real opinions about it but whose primary interest in the conversation was not the subject matter itself. Somewhere in the second hour, Vale asked the question that Mio had predicted he would ask at approximately this stage of the contact protocol. "What is your relationship," he said, with the careful phrasing of someone who had considered the exact formulation, "to the current governance structure?" This was not the question in its final form. The final form would be more specific. But this was the orienting question, the one whose answer determined the shape of the subsequent ones. Mio had prepared him for it with the specificity of someone designing packaging for a particular recipient, and the preparation had included not just what to say but how to say it, the register, the pacing, the degree of apparent deliberation before response. He took the appropriate amount of time. "I think the current structure has genuine value and genuine limitations," he said. The rating game system as a social architecture is sophisticated. The governance framework around it is less so, in some respects. There are aspects of the current arrangement that I find historically contingent rather than principled, and historical contingency tends to produce arrangements that serve whoever was in the room when the contingency was resolved rather than whoever the arrangement claims to serve. Vale listened to this with the attention of someone receiving a response that was neither the expected agreement nor the expected resistance, but something that required more careful processing. "That's a nuanced position," he said. "It's an honest one," Issei said. I've found that the nuanced position tends to be closer to accurate than either of the positions that don't require nuance. The people I work with, Vale said, and the phrase was itself a small disclosure, an acknowledgement of the existence of a people I work with that was not the administrative observer class, would find some of that perspective interesting and some of it less so. Which parts? The historical contingency observation is interesting. The whoever the arrangement claims to serve framing is the less so part. It implies a skepticism about the stated purposes of the current arrangement that would be read as potentially adversarial to certain interests. I'm not adversarial to any specific interests, Issei said. I'm genuinely uncertain about what the correct governance structure looks like and genuinely convinced that the current one is not it. Those are related but not identical positions. Vale sat with this for a long moment. He was good at sitting with things. It was a quality that Issei had noticed in their earlier meetings and that Shiro's social topography work had confirmed was characteristic. The patience of someone who had learned that the most useful information often arrived after a silence rather than during a response. The people I work with, Vale said again, more slowly, are not uniform in their perspectives. There is a range. The range includes people who would find your position interesting rather than adversarial. I would like you to meet some of them. I'd be open to that, Issei said. This was the second move. The first move had been the gathering and the first element. The second was this, being introduced into the interior of the network, not as an observer but as someone whose perspective was being evaluated for a purpose not yet named. The interior was where the doctrinal instruction sessions happened. The interior was where the fragile commitments had been made. The interior was where the sentence, when it arrived, would arrive in the conditions that allowed it to complete itself. He walked back to the station in the November night, and moved through the streets with the grammar of the city rather than against it, his presence distributed in the way that Nagi had spent 3 months teaching him, and the city received him as it received all things that moved through it with sufficient patience, as a temporary feature of an environment that was primary, that would be there after he was gone. That had its own continuity, and its own logic and its own accumulated weight of meaning, none of which required him to announce himself to be real. The valley was behind him. The sentence was ahead. The garden had been watered, the soil had been prepared, the first seeds had been placed in conditions that allowed for germination, and the gardener was, for the first time since arriving in the valley with nothing that made sound, beginning to understand what patience actually meant in the register of the body rather than the register of the concept. It meant this: the willingness to be in the present moment of the work without demanding that the work be finished, the capacity to inhabit each stage of a long process fully rather than experiencing it as the insufficient precursor of a future stage. The understanding that the sentence being composed was not less real because it was incomplete, and that the incompleteness was not a failure but a function of being genuinely in the middle of something rather than at its end. He had been in the middle of things before. He had not always known it. Now he knew it, and the knowing was a kind of equipment that he had not had before, and he wore it the way the valley had taught him to wear the things that were genuinely his, not as a display but as an orientation, a permanent adjustment of the direction in which he faced. Oren Vale had promised introductions. In the offices of the Conservative Interests Advisory Body, in the rooms where the doctrinal instruction sessions continued on their bi-weekly schedule, in the atmospheric accumulation of intention that Natsuki was still reading and the residue that Rin was still calibrating, the people with fragile commitments were sitting with their incompleteness, waiting, though they did not know it, for the recognition that was coming toward them in the packaging that Mio was still designing, through the channel that Issei was still building, at the moment that the garden would be ready. Not yet. But not never either. The middle of things has its own kind of certainty. Act 3. The Interior and its Weather. Chapter 10. The Room Behind the Room. Introductions and their Geometries. Vale's introductions did not happen quickly, which was itself a piece of information. In the social architecture of the Conservative Interests Network, introductions at the level Vale had implied were not casual social transactions but formally weighted events, each one requiring a preparation period in which the person being introduced was evaluated against criteria that were never explicitly stated and a post-introduction period in which the introduction's success was measured against outcomes that were also never explicitly stated. The implicit nature of both the criteria and the outcomes was not an accident. It was the method by which the network maintained the fiction that it was a community of shared interests rather than a hierarchical organization with membership conditions and loyalty assessments. Issei had expected the delay. Mio had predicted it with the confidence of someone who had been studying the rhetoric of organizations like this for long enough to have developed a reliable model. She described the preparation period as the network's equivalent of reading the room before speaking, a systematic process of determining what kind of listener you were dealing with before deciding what kind of speaker to be. The network would watch his social behavior for several more months, track his conversations at events where its observers were present, monitor whether his expressed positions remained consistent or shifted in ways that suggested either unreliability or the specific kind of responsiveness that the network read as susceptibility to alignment. Consistency was what they were watching for. The network, by Mio's analysis, did not want enthusiasts. Enthusiasts were unreliable in proportion to their enthusiasm, their positions dependent on the maintenance of an emotional state rather than a considered alignment of interest. What the network wanted was people whose positions were stable because they were genuinely held, because they derived from an authentic reading of the world that happened to produce conclusions compatible with the network's purposes. The irony of this, which Mio noted with the specific pleasure she took in well-constructed ironies, was that it meant the network was actively selecting for the kind of autonomous thinker who was, in the long run, also the kind of person most likely to reconsider a position when presented with sufficient evidence that the position was wrong. In the meantime, there was the rating game circuit. Issei won the fourth game decisively, and the fifth narrowly, and lost the sixth in a way that Mio had not designed but that she analyzed afterward as accidentally ideal, a loss produced by a genuine tactical error that he had not foreseen, which meant the loss had the authentic texture of a competitive setback rather than the performed texture of a calculated one. The community's reading of the sequence was exactly what the 4-month plan had been designed to produce, a competitor of genuine and developing ability whose trajectory was notable without being exceptional, whose losses were educational rather than definitive, who was ascending through the circuit at the pace of someone who was doing the work rather than the pace of someone who had already done it. The losses and wins were also producing a secondary effect that Issei had not fully anticipated. Kasaka, the competitor he had lost to in the third game, had become a genuine professional acquaintance. She attended several of the same social events, she had opinions about his tactical development that were accurate, and that she shared without ceremony, and she was connected, through relationships that Shiro was mapping with increasing detail, to a layer of the mid-tier rating game community that included a number of people in the early stages of the network's contact protocol. She was not an agent of the network. She was a person of independent mind who found Issei's approach to the game interesting and whose presence in the same social spaces created, without any design on his part, a web of mutual acquaintance that was useful in ways he was still cataloging. Himari had noted this, in one of the monthly assessments she prepared for the collective. She noted it without judgment, in the mode of observation that the Valley had also taught, a fact about the social environment that the environment had produced, and that deserved to be recorded accurately without being either celebrated or discounted. He brought the assessment to Mio, and she read it with her comprehensive attention and said, "Kasaka is socially adjacent to 2 of the 5 fragile commitments that Natsuki identified. Not a relationship of depth, but a relationship of regular presence and mutual respect. She is someone whose opinion they would register." "I am not going to use Kasaka," Issei said immediately. Mio looked at him. "I did not suggest that you should. I noted the adjacency as a fact about the landscape. Knowing the landscape does not commit you to using every feature of it." "I know," he said. "I said it immediately because I wanted to be clear about it before I thought about it too long." Mio was quiet for a moment. "That," she said, "is a useful kind of self-knowledge." The second gathering and a new face. The second invitation to the Minato Ward property arrived in January, 3 months after the first. The occasion was described as a discussion evening on the theme of governance philosophy, which was a framing that Shiro identified as new. Previous events at the property had been described in the invitations as social gatherings or informal consultations, and the explicit naming of a philosophical theme represented an escalation in the explicitness of the network's purpose that Mio read as a sign that Issei's file had crossed an internal threshold. They are no longer observing you, she said. They are beginning to include you. The distinction is small from the outside but significant from the inside. Being observed means they are gathering information. Being included means they have gathered enough information to begin the process of alignment. The discussion evening is the beginning of that process. They will present a version of the doctrine, not the full version, a curated version designed for someone at your stage, and they will watch how you receive it. What is the correct reception? Genuine engagement with the material combined with thoughtful reservation about the specific conclusions. You are a serious thinker who finds the questions interesting but is not yet persuaded by the answers. This is accurate, and it is also the reception that prolongs the relationship. Agreement ends the process. Outright rejection ends the process. Genuine thoughtful engagement continues it. And continued engagement means continued access. Yes. The interior is not entered by accepting the doctrine. It is entered by being someone who the people inside the doctrine find worth talking to. Those are different things and the network confuses them regularly, which is one of its structural weaknesses. He arrived at the property on a Tuesday evening in January to find 14 people in the main gathering room, a subset of the 23 he had encountered at the first event, reorganized in a way that Shiro's social topography work identified as the network's regular inner circle configuration, the 6 to 8 core attendees from Ren's residue report. 4 people he recognized from subsequent events as regular peripheral members, and 2 faces that were entirely new. One of the new faces was a woman named Fuyuko Sato, who was introduced to the group as a visiting perspective from the administrative structures of the Western Territories. She was approximately 40 in human reckoning, carried the specific quality of someone who had been in consequential rooms for long enough that the quality of the room no longer affected how she occupied it, and she listened to the opening discussion with the attention of someone who was evaluating the discussants rather than the discussion. Natsuki, reading the atmospheric record of the room at her next visit, would identify Fuyuko Sato's presence as the most significant single event in the property's accumulated atmospheric history. Not because of what Sato had said during the evening. Because of what she had decided, in that room, in the interval between arriving and leaving, a decision whose weight in the atmosphere was, by Natsuki's description, the specific atmospheric signature of someone crossing a threshold that they had been approaching for a very long time and that they were crossing not with enthusiasm but with the specific gravity of someone who has run out of reasons to not cross it. Issei did not know this yet. He knew only that Fuyuko Sato listened to everything in the room with evaluative attention and said almost nothing, and that when she said the 2 things she did say, both of them were questions rather than statements. And both questions were the kind that revealed more about the questioner's framework than any statement would have. The first question was, who determines which historical contingencies are recoverable and which are not? The second was, if the doctrine's purpose is restoration, what is the specific thing being restored, and who was present at its original construction? Both questions were received by the room with the particular stillness of questions that everyone in the room had been not asking for some time, and that the arrival of a stranger had made briefly askable. The answers given were fluent and doctrinally consistent, and completely failed to address the actual questions, which was itself a response of a kind. On the walk back to the station, Issei replayed both questions in the mode of attention that Nagi had taught him, not analyzing them immediately but receiving them, letting them occupy the attentional space they deserved before he began to work with them. They were good questions. They were, in fact, the same questions from 2 different angles, both of them aimed at the same structural vulnerability in the doctrine that Shirogane had identified from the outside 3 decades ago, the gap between what the doctrine claimed to be restoring and what the people who had constructed it had actually wanted. Fuyuko Sato had been asking those questions for a long time. She had been asking them silently, in the interior of her own attention, and something about being in that room on that evening had moved them from the interior to the exterior. This was not a trivial transition. He contacted Mio that night through the dead drop system. The message was brief. New individual, Western Territories background, asked the 2 structural questions, appears to have reached a decision point. Need Shiro to map her and Natsuki to read whatever spaces she has recently occupied. Mio's response arrived the next morning. It said, I have been waiting for someone like this. The outer ring members are useful for access. She could be useful for the sentence itself. what Shiro found in 12 days. Shiro's social topography work on Fuyuko Sato took 12 days and produced a map of a career that had the specific shape of a trajectory interrupted. She had entered the administrative structures of the faction's Western Territories 22 years ago as a junior coordinator, one of several dozen similar figures who had come through the standard pathway of ideological alignment followed by organizational integration. In the early years, her trajectory had been entirely consistent with the doctrine. She had moved upward through the hierarchy with the specific velocity of someone whose work was being noticed for the right reasons by the right people, participating in the kinds of decisions that the doctrine needed people of competence to execute, and she had participated in them with the competence they required. At some point approximately 14 years ago, the trajectory had changed. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would have registered in the official record as anything other than a normal career adjustment. She had moved laterally rather than upward, from an operations-facing role to an administrative-facing one, from a position of executing decisions to a position of documenting them. The documentation role was not a demotion by any formal measure. It was, however, a position from which the full scope of what was being decided became visible to her in a way that the operations role had not permitted. Shiro noted in her report that the lateral move and the two structural questions asked in the gathering room were separated by exactly 14 years. She noted this without interpretation, because interpretation was Mio's territory, but the noting was itself a form of interpretation, a placing of two facts in proximity that requested the observer to do the arithmetic. Issei did the arithmetic. 14 years of accumulating the documentary evidence of decisions made in the doctrine's name by people who were using the doctrine as a vehicle for decisions that had nothing to do with what the doctrine claimed to be for. 14 years of maintaining the documentation with the competence that the role required, of being a person who was too good at her job to be removed and too aware of what she was documenting to be entirely comfortable with the doing of it. 14 years of asking the two structural questions in the interior of her own attention, in the space between what she was writing down and what it actually meant. And then a gathering in the Minato ward of Tokyo, on a Tuesday evening in January, where the questions had arrived in the exterior because something in the room or in herself had changed enough to allow it. He brought this to Natsuki, who had not yet had access to any space that Sato had recently occupied. He described the trajectory. He described the questions. He described the specific quality of the decision that Natsuki had identified in the room's atmosphere. Natsuki listened with the distributed attention that was her characteristic mode. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time in the way that she was sometimes quiet, not the silence of someone thinking but the silence of someone receiving. She has been carrying something for 14 years, she said finally. People who carry things for 14 years do not put them down easily. But they also reach a point where not putting them down is more costly than putting them down. The question is whether she has reached that point, or whether the questions in the room were preliminary. Whether she is deciding or whether she has decided. Can you tell the difference? If I can get into a space she has recently occupied, yes, Natsuki said. The atmospheric signature of decision and the atmospheric signature of deciding are different. Decision has weight. Deciding has texture. Which do you expect? She was quiet again. From the description of the room and what I read in it that evening, she said, I expect decision. But I have been wrong before, and this is important enough to verify rather than assume. Chapter 11, The Weight of Documents. Access and what it costs. Getting Natsuki into a space that Fuyuko Sato had recently occupied required a chain of access that took 3 weeks to construct and that Issei found more uncomfortable than any aspect of the operation to date, not because the methods were objectionable but because it required him to use the relationship with Veil in a way that moved it from parallel to instrumental. A distinction that he had been careful to maintain and that could not, at this point, be maintained. Veil had mentioned, at their most recent meeting, that Sato would be attending a professional seminar on supernatural administrative law that was being held at a conference facility in Yokohama in early February. The mention was incidental, not directed at Issei, not an offer of any kind, simply a piece of social information exchanged in the course of a conversation about the network's activity in the Western Territories. Issei had received it as incidental information and filed it without visible response. What he had actually done with it was bring it to Yua, who had spent 3 days constructing the access path, an identity that had legitimate standing to attend the same seminar, a cover history sufficient to survive the level of verification that a professional supernatural administrative law seminar would apply to attendees, and a tactical plan for Natsuki's positioning during the event that would give her access to the spaces Sato occupied without requiring any direct interaction between them. The seminar ran for 2 days. Natsuki attended as the junior associate of a minor administrative practice from the Nagoya area, an identity that Yua had not worn before and that she inhabited with the complete thoroughness that was her method, the Nagoya accent absorbed not as performance but as genuine expression of an aspect of herself that happened to require that dialect to be audible. The professional posture of a junior associate carried not as a layer over her own posture but as the posture itself, the slight deference toward senior practitioners expressed not as a social calculation but as a genuine orientation of someone who was actually junior relative to the room and knew it. Natsuki spent the first day reading the conference facility, the ambient atmospheric accumulation of a space that had hosted hundreds of professional gatherings, the dense layering of professional intention and professional anxiety and professional calculation that accreted in a place used for evaluation and certification over many years. This baseline reading was essential for the second day's work, because without it the specific signatures of individual occupants would be indistinguishable from the facility's own accumulated weight. On the second day, in a break between sessions, Fuyuko Sato sat alone for 11 minutes in a small lounge off the main corridor, and Natsuki passed through that lounge twice in the capacity of someone looking for the coffee station, and the 2 passages took a total of 4 minutes, and what Natsuki read in those 4 minutes was enough. Her report reached Issei 3 days later. He read it in the room above the stationery shop with the door closed, and the window cracked to the February cold. Matsuda, the stationer, was moving around in the shop below with the specific pattern of movement that meant she was reorganizing the display cases, a task she undertook every February with ceremonial regularity. The report said decision? Not deciding. The threshold was crossed before the gathering in January. The gathering was the first public expression of a private conclusion that had been reached some time before, possibly weeks, possibly longer. The quality of what she is carrying has changed from the accumulation of something born over time to the specific gravity of someone who knows what they are going to do and is waiting for the conditions that make doing it possible. She is not waiting for permission. She is waiting for a channel. He read the last sentence 3 times. A channel was something he could provide. What Mio built in 6 weeks. Mio's packaging for Fuyuko Sato took 6 weeks, which was twice as long as Issei had expected and exactly as long as Mio had said it would take when he first brought her the problem. He had questioned the timeline at the time. Mio had responded with the patience of someone accustomed to having their professional judgment questioned by people who did not fully understand the profession. The packaging for someone who has already reached a private decision is different from the packaging for someone who is still deciding, she had explained. For the deciding person, the packaging must provide a reason to conclude. For the decided person, the packaging must provide 2 things simultaneously: validation that the conclusion they have reached is accurate, and a channel for the energy of that conclusion that is constructive rather than destructive. Get either one wrong and you produce a different outcome than intended. Give only validation without a channel and the conclusion intensifies without direction, becoming the kind of private certainty that produces erratic behavior. Give only a channel without validation and the person uses the channel before their conviction is complete enough to sustain what using the channel costs. 6 weeks to get both right, Issei had said. 6 weeks to get both right for this specific person in this specific situation, Mio had confirmed. A different person would require different work. Sato has spent 14 years being precisely accurate in her documentation. She will receive the validation only if the information I use to provide it is itself precisely accurate. Any imprecision in the packaging fails, because she will recognize the imprecision and conclude that the source is unreliable. What information are you using? The documentary record, Mio had said simply. 14 years of it. This was the part of the 6 weeks that was not Mio's work alone. Ren had returned to the Minato Ward property 4 more times in the interval, each time under covers arranged by Yua, and her residue readings had reached a level of calibration where she could extract from the accumulated record of the documentation sessions a reasonably complete picture of what had been documented and by whom and when the documentation had been reviewed and what had been done in response to it. The picture was not complete. Residue reading was not a perfect instrument, and the density of the accumulation in the properties gathering room meant that some of the older record was irrecoverable, overlaid by more recent events to the point where its signal could not be separated from the noise. What was recoverable was enough. It was enough because the pattern did not require complete documentation to be legible. What the pattern showed, in the partial record that Rin had assembled across 6 visits and 47 pages of precise handwriting, was a systematic divergence between the doctrine's stated purposes and the decisions that were actually being made in the doctrine's name. Resource allocations that served individual advancement rather than collective goals. Territorial decisions that produced outcomes contrary to the restoration framework the doctrine described as its purpose, internal. Disciplinary actions against figures who had raised exactly the kind of structural questions that Fuyuko Sato had raised in the gathering room, questions asked silently rather than publicly, and silenced by methods that the doctrine's stated framework explicitly prohibited. The doctrine was not being lived by the people who administered it. This was not a new discovery. Shirogane had identified it from the outside 3 decades ago. But knowing something from the outside and having the precise documentary record of it from the inside were different categories of knowledge, and the second was what Mio needed to build packaging that would be recognized as valid by someone with 14 years of direct access to the documentation. She built it over 6 weeks into a form that Issei found remarkable not for its sophistication but for its simplicity. It was a single document. 8 pages. Every claim in it was sourced to a specific piece of the documentary record, cited with the precision of someone who understood that the citation was not a formality but the substance of the argument. Not because I say so but because the record you kept says so. It was not addressed to Fuyuko Sato by name. It did not need to be. It was addressed to the person who had the specific professional history that made its content recognizable, and only one person in the network had that history. The channel, Issei said, when she presented it. How does it reach her? Through the dead drop system, Mio said. But not through Rin's version. Through one she doesn't know is a dead drop. He looked at her. You built a channel she doesn't know is a channel. I built a channel that looks like a piece of ordinary administrative correspondence, delivered through an ordinary administrative pathway that she uses routinely for professional materials. It will arrive in a context where administrative correspondence is the expected thing to arrive, and it will contain something that is not administrative correspondence, and the difference between what she expected and what she received will itself be part of the packaging. Because the difference will tell her that someone went to considerable trouble, Issei said slowly. Which will tell her that the someone who went to the trouble has access to things that ordinary people don't have access to. Which will tell her that the validation the document provides is coming from a source with real knowledge rather than a source that is guessing. Yes, Mio said. The medium is the first part of the message. February and the waiting. After the document was sent, Issei did what Shirogane had trained him to do. He waited without performing the waiting, continuing the work that was continuable and declining to invent work for the parts that required patience rather than action. The rating games circuit provided the structure for the waiting. He competed in 2 games in February, 1 win and 1 draw, both of them genuine contests rather than designed outcomes, because the 4-month plan had been completed and what remained was the maintenance of the competitive profile rather than its construction. Kosaka attended the second game as an observer and afterward they had dinner at a restaurant she chose in Shibuya and talked about the game for an hour and about other things for another hour, and the other things included several observations about the rating game's relationship to the broader supernatural governance structure that were both accurate, and, when held against the developing picture of the operation, quietly significant. She was not a fragile commitment. She was not inside the network at all. But she was someone who had spent 7 years in the upper brackets of a system that the network used as an observation ground, and she had formed opinions about the system that were her own and that she held with the genuine conviction of someone who had reached them through experience rather than instruction. The problem with the current structure, she said, at one point in the second hour, is not that it's wrong about what it values. The problem is that it values the wrong things while claiming to value the right ones. If it were honestly transactional, I could respect it more easily. It's the claimed idealism that makes the actual practice so difficult to look at directly. He heard this in the mode that Nagi had taught him, receiving it fully before doing anything with it. Setting it in the accumulation of what he was building. Not pressing. Not directing. Not doing anything with the moment except being present in it. I think about that a lot, he said. Which was true. Kasaka looked at him for a moment with the evaluative attention she brought to games. I think you are more invested in the structural problem than you let on publicly, she said. Probably, he said. Good, she said. People who are not invested in the structural problem tend to either not see it or not care about it. Both are worse than seeing it and being invested in it. He filed this conversation in the same place he had been filing all the conversations, not as evidence of anything specific, but as texture, the accumulating texture of a world that was more ready for a new sentence than the people who controlled the current grammar were prepared to acknowledge. Himari's web, which had by this point extended its monitoring threads to 6 locations across the Minato and Shinjuku wards, registered a change in the network's communication patterns in the 3rd week of February. Not a dramatic change. Not the kind of change that standard surveillance would flag. But the pattern of which nodes were communicating with which other nodes shifted in a way that was consistent with a new piece of information entering the network at a specific point and propagating outward through the relationship structure in the pattern that Shiro's social topography had identified as characteristic of information that was significant rather than routine. The new piece of information had entered the network at a node that Shiro identified as Fuyuko Sato. She had shown the document to someone. Chapter 12, Propagation. The shape of spread. Himari's analysis of the propagation pattern took 4 days, during which she ate almost nothing and slept in the intermittent way of someone engaged in the kind of close attentional work that is incompatible with the regular rhythms of ordinary life. She had the quality, during these periods, of being very fully elsewhere, present in the room in the physical sense, absent from it in the sense that mattered for conversation, her attention distributed through the web threads in a way that made her ordinary social presence feel like a secondary process running in the background of a primary computation. She surfaced on the 4th day and presented her analysis at a collective meeting that Issei had called in the Kyoto room above the stationery shop, all 6 of them present in the actual room rather than the distributed mode they used for routine communication. Matsuda, who had observed the supernatural community long enough to understand that certain activities of its members required privacy, had brought tea up the stairs in the morning without asking questions and had not come up again. The document reached 6 people in the first 72 hours, Himari said. She was using the notation system she had developed for the web thread analysis, marks on paper that looked like something between cartography and music theory and that the rest of the collective had learned to read over the previous months. Sato showed it to 2 people directly. Those 2 people each showed it to 2 more. The propagation stopped at the 2nd degree, which is consistent with information that people find significant enough to share with their most trusted contacts, but that they are not yet ready to share more broadly. Who are the 6? Issei asked. Shiro had already mapped 3 of them from the web thread analysis's directional data. Himari had identified 2 more through patterns in the communication changes. The 6th was not yet identified, but its position in the network topology suggested a senior administrative figure rather than a mid-tier one. Of the 5 identified, Natsuki had atmospheric access to 2 of them through spaces associated with their network participation, and what she had read in those spaces over the past months was consistent with the fragile commitment category she had identified at the Minato ward property. One of the remaining 3 Shiro had mapped as someone with a long professional history of working within the doctrine while privately maintaining positions that the doctrine would have found uncomfortable. Not someone on the verge of action, but someone who had reached the equilibrium of long-term private dissent without the activation that would convert dissent into movement. The document may be the activation, Mio said. She had been quiet through most of Himari's presentation, reading the notation system with the focus she brought to packaging problems. For someone in that equilibrium state, the document does 2 things. It validates the private positions they have been maintaining for years, which reduces the cognitive cost of continuing to maintain them in a context where they might be expressed rather than suppressed. And it demonstrates that the information ecosystem they have been operating in has a layer they were not aware of, which changes their assessment of what is possible. It tells them they are not alone, Rin said, from the window where she was sitting. She said it simply, without theoretical framing, and it was the simplest and most accurate version of what Mio had been explaining. The room was quiet for a moment, with the specific quality of a room in which something has been said so clearly that there is nothing to add to it immediately. Yes, Mio said. That is the function of the first element. Not to change anyone. To tell them they are not alone. Issei thought about Shirogane in the valley, the bark paper covered in a notation system that he had spent months learning to read, the sequence of elements that she had been planning for 30 years. He thought about the patience of something that had decided, at the beginning of the project, that the project was worth doing and had not subsequently revisited that decision, but had simply continued the work. The patience was not the absence of urgency. It was the specific form of urgency that understood that urgency applied to the wrong timescale produced the wrong outcomes. We need to know who the sixth person is, he said. The sixth node. Identifying the sixth node took 3 weeks, during which the web thread analysis, Shiro's social topography work, and Ren's residue readings all proceeded in parallel and in coordination, each discipline contributing observations that the others could use to constrain the space of possible answers until the space became small enough to resolve. Ren's contribution was the most decisive. She had, across the multiple visits to the Minato Ward property, been building a picture of the governance structure of the inner circle that was now detailed enough to include the approximate seniority levels of the regular participants. The instruction sessions that she had identified early in the operation were, she had concluded, conducted by a rotating set of senior figures rather than a single instructor, and the rotation pattern was itself informative. It reflected an internal organizational structure in which authority was distributed among 3 or 4 senior individuals who took turns in the instructional role in a way that was probably determined by a scheduling mechanism she had not been able to directly observe. The sixth node, she concluded, was one of the rotating instructors. The atmospheric signature of the communication between Sato and the sixth node had the specific quality, in Himari's thread analysis, of a horizontal communication, not the upward communication of a junior member reporting to a senior, and not the downward communication of a senior directing a junior, but the peer-level communication of 2 people who occupy equivalent positions in a hierarchy and are sharing something rather than reporting or directing. Sato was a senior administrative figure in the Western Territories. The sixth node was a senior administrative figure of equivalent standing in a different part of the structure. Shiro's topography work narrowed it further. The peer-level communication from a senior Western Territories administrator to an equivalently senior figure in a different part of the structure, following the receipt of a document that described the structural divergence between doctrine and practice, was consistent with the social topography pattern she called confirmation seeking. Someone who had received information that was significant and potentially destabilizing was reaching out to a peer not to report up the chain but to confirm that their assessment of the information was sound. The peer being reached was someone who could confirm or disconfirm the assessment from their own experience, which meant they had been in a position to observe the same divergence between doctrine and practice. On the 3rd week, Natsuki requested access to the seminar facility in Yokohama, where the administrative law seminar had been held in February, and which was being used again in March for a follow-on event. The access took Yua 2 days to arrange. Natsuki spent 40 minutes in the facility's small lounge, the same lounge where she had read Sato's atmospheric signature in February, and what she found there was not just the residue of the February seminar but the recent residue of a subsequent visit, a single individual who had been in the lounge for approximately 30 minutes in the past week. The atmospheric signature of the recent visit was, she reported, unlike anything she had read before in the context of the operation. Not fragile commitment. Not the weight of a long-held private conclusion waiting for a channel. Something different and considerably more complex. The atmospheric signature of someone who had known the truth of the divergence for much longer than Sato had, who had made a different accommodation with that knowledge, and who was now reconsidering whether the accommodation was the right one. Not deciding, Natsuki said, when she reported. Redeciding. They made a decision a long time ago to remain inside the structure despite knowing what the structure was. They are now asking whether that decision still holds. What changed? Sato's document, Natsuki said. Or rather, the fact of Sato's document. The fact that someone with access to the documentary record had assembled it, and passed it to peers rather than to the hierarchy tells this person something they did not know, that the accommodation they made, the private decision to remain inside and maintain private dissent, is not unique. Others made the same accommodation. Others are reconsidering it. The isolation of the private decision has been breached. They are not alone, Rin said again, from the window. They are not alone, Natsuki confirmed. The sixth node was a woman named Rei Atsuki who had been in senior administrative positions within the faction's organizational structure for 19 years. Shiro found her in the social topography within a day of Natsuki's identification, mapping her career with the same systematic patience she'd brought to all mapping. Atsuki's career had the same interrupted trajectory as Sato's, the same lateral move from an operations-facing role to a documentation and administrative role, the same specific timing that placed the lateral move at approximately the point in her career where the documentary record she had access to would have made the structural divergence visible. 19 years of private accommodation. 19 years of doing excellent work in a role that gave her complete access to the gap between what the doctrine said and what the doctrine did. She was the person who had been in the room for most of the instruction sessions. She was one of the rotating instructors. Issei sat with this for a long time. He sat with it the way Shirogane had taught him to sit with information that was not yet complete enough to act on, fully present to it, either rushing toward conclusions nor avoiding them, simply receiving what it was. What it was this: a person of 19 years standing inside the faction's administrative structure, with access to the documentary record of its operational divergence from its own doctrine, who had been instructing new members of the inner circle in the doctrine for long enough to have her own version of its questions, who had just received through a peer channel information that confirmed that her private accommodation was not unique. A person like that, in that position, with that access, was not a peripheral target for the sentence. She was not an outer ring consideration. She was, if the right packaging arrived in the right channel at the right moment, something the operation had not planned for because it was too good to plan for, a source rather than a recipient. Someone who could provide, from the inside, the subsequent elements that the sentence required, because she had been accumulating those elements for 19 years and the question was no longer whether she had them but whether the channel existed through which she could use them. The compound's third effect. Ao's message arrived through the dead drop in the third week of March, and it was the longest communication she had sent in the operation's history, which meant something, because Ao did not write long communications unless the information required the length. She had been conducting a longitudinal analysis of the compound's behavior in the Minato Ward property, using data from Ren's residue readings and Himari's web thread analyses as proxy measures for the environmental concentration and its effects on the people regularly occupying the space. The analysis was not direct measurement. They did not have access to the facility's air chemistry and they were not in a position to conduct the kind of controlled study that would have produced definitive results in a laboratory setting. What Ao had instead was a model built from the proxy measures, refined across 4 months of data, and the model was now producing predictions that she was able to test against observable outcomes with a reliability that she characterized, with the precision of a technically rigorous person, as exceeding the threshold for provisional confidence. The first effect of the compound was the one she had designed for: reduced cognitive resistance to reconsideration in individuals regularly occupying the treated space. The proxy measures were consistent with this effect being present and active across the inner circle's core membership, at an intensity that was somewhat higher than she had projected from the formulation, which she attributed to the accumulation effect in the ventilation system that Ren had identified in the second month. The second effect was the one she had identified after the first visit's unintended accumulation, the property-wide ambient concentration gradually treating the spaces beyond the primary gathering room, including the secondary meeting rooms and the corridor connecting them, at a sub-threshold concentration that was producing a slower and more diffuse version of the primary effect across the full range of people who regularly used the facility. The third effect was the one she had not designed for and had not anticipated, and that was, she wrote, the most significant of the three from the perspective of what the operation was trying to accomplish. In individuals who had already reached a decision point before the compound's introduction, the compound was not reducing the resistance to reconsideration. There was no resistance to reduce, because the reconsideration had already occurred privately. What the compound was doing in those individuals was reducing the social anxiety associated with expressing the private reconsideration in a context where expressing it carried social costs. Not eliminating the anxiety. Reducing it. Making the cost of expression feel, at the level of the body's assessment of risk, slightly less prohibitive than it had before. This was, she wrote, consistent with the known secondary pharmacology of the compound's base components, which she had published the theoretical framework for 11 years ago without anyone apparently reading it. She noted this without apparent resentment. The compounds were not read because the compounds were not considered a strategic asset by anyone who was not a Lamia, and the Lamia did not publish in the venues that the strategic community monitored. The practical significance was as follows. Of the 6 people who had received Sato's document, at least 4 had been regular attendees at the Minato Ward property over the period of the compound's activity. For those 4, the anxiety associated with what Sato's document represented had been modulated by an environmental factor they were entirely unaware of. The document had been easier to pass around, in part, because the room in which they had been deciding had been, for 4 months, gradually and invisibly reducing the felt cost of expression. Issei read this twice. He thought about gardening. He thought about soil preparation. He wrote to Ao through the dead drop. Has the compound affected the instruction sessions? Her response arrived the next morning, yes. The instruction sessions are conducted primarily in the secondary meeting room, which is in the ventilation path. The instructors have been regularly occupying a treated space for 4 months. The effect on the instructors is the same as on the attendees. Reduced cognitive resistance to reconsideration. What this means for the quality of the instruction, whether the doctrine is being taught with the same conviction it was taught with before, I cannot determine from the proxy data. You would need Natsuki's reading of the room to answer that. He wrote to Natsuki. Her response took a day to arrive and it was, characteristically, precise. The instruction sessions, she wrote, have been changing. Not in content that she could read from the residue. Content was Ren's territory and Ren would need to do the reading. But in the atmospheric signature of the intention behind the instruction. For the first 2 months of her reading, the instruction sessions had produced an atmospheric signature consistent with genuine instruction, the sincere intent to transmit belief. For the past 2 months, the signature had been changing towards something more complex. Not insincere, but divided. The division was consistent with someone who was transmitting a belief they were simultaneously re-examining. Ryotsuki had been teaching a doctrine she was reconsidering, in a room whose atmosphere had been modifying the felt cost of that reconsideration, for 2 months. The garden was not only growing. It was growing in directions that exceeded the design. Chapter 13, The Valley's Judgment. The report and what it required. He went back to the valley in April. He went because the operation had reached a point where the next decisions were beyond the scope of what he had been authorized to make on his own, not in the formal sense of authorization, because the arrangement with Shirogane had not been structured with formal authorization mechanisms, but in the practical sense that the situation had developed into something that had not been anticipated in the planning and that warranted consultation before the next action. This was not a failure of his judgment. It was a recognition that the limits of any individual's judgment were real and that the appropriate response to reaching them was not to pretend they did not exist but to find the people whose judgment complemented one's own and consult them. The valley received him the way it received everything, without adjustment. He came in from the north path in the late afternoon, moving the way he had learned to move there, the grammar of his passage shaped by the months of training and the months of subsequent practice. And the forest did not register him as a disturbance. He was not certain whether this was because his passage was actually that clean, or because the valley was simply not in the business of registering things as disturbances. He had not yet resolved this question, and suspected it might not be resolvable. Keiro met him at the settlement entrance. She looked at him the way she looked at everything, with the comprehensive attention that was her characteristic mode, the evaluation that never seemed to conclude because she was always finding new data to incorporate. You moved differently, she said. 5 months of practice, he said. Not just practice, she said. You have been moving through things that require the grammar. It shows. A pause. Shirogane is in the common area. Shirogane was on the worn stone, as she had been when he arrived the first time and when he left. The bark paper was on the table. She looked at him for a long moment with the attention that had been evaluating him since before he arrived. Sit, she said. He sat and he told her everything, in the precise order that it had occurred, because the order was part of the information, and rearranging it for narrative convenience would have changed what she received. He told her about the gathering and the compound's introduction. He told her about Ren's residue work and the unintended accumulation effect. He told her about Sato and the document, and its propagation to 6 nodes including Atsuki. He told her about the compound's third effect, the reduction of expression anxiety in people who had already reached private decision points. He told her about Natsuki's reading of the instruction sessions, and what it suggested about the quality of the doctrine being transmitted. He told her about the thing he had not yet told the collective, his assessment, held privately for 2 weeks while he worked out whether he trusted it, that the situation had reached a threshold that the original operation design had not anticipated, a threshold at which the people inside the network who were reconsidering their positions were closer to a significant action than the operation had planned for them to be. Not because the operation had rushed them. Because the operation had succeeded in ways that were non-linear, each element interacting with the others to produce effects that were not simply additive but multiplicative in some cases, and the cumulative result was a situation that was more advanced than the original timeline had projected. Shirogane listened to all of this without interruption, which was her method. When he finished, she was quiet for the time she required to integrate what she had heard, which was not a short time, and Issei sat in the quiet the way the valley had taught him to sit in quiet, as a condition rather than a gap, as something full rather than something empty. The compound's third effect, she said finally. AO could not have predicted this because the compound has never been deployed in this specific configuration before. The theoretical framework was sound. The specific emergent behavior in a space with long-term habituated occupants who had pre-existing private reconsiderations is new data. It changed the timeline, Issei said. It changed the timeline, she confirmed. The question is how. There are 2 ways the timeline changes when an operation develops faster than projected. The first is that you maintain the original timeline and the gap between the operation's readiness and the target population's readiness grows, which means the intervention is late relative to the window of maximum receptivity, and the window may close before the intervention is complete. The second is that you revise the timeline to match the actual development, which requires ensuring that the subsequent elements are ready for the revised schedule. The subsequent elements depend on Atsuki, Issei said. Yes. If Atsuki is a source rather than a recipient, he said slowly, because he was constructing the sentence as he spoke it and he wanted to construct it correctly, then the subsequent elements do not need to be prepared from outside. They exist inside, accumulated over 19 years, waiting for the channel. The question is whether the channel that currently exists between the operation and Atsuki is sufficient for the materials she carries, or whether it needs to be strengthened before she can use it. Shirogane looked at him for a long time. And your assessment? The channel that exists is the document that Sato received and passed to her, he said. It is a one-way channel. She can read it but she cannot respond through it, cannot test whether the source is reliable enough to act in relation to, cannot assess whether the channel is strong enough to carry what she has been carrying for 19 years. He paused. She needs a channel that goes both ways. Which requires a contact, Shirogane said. Yes. And the contact requires a cover that is not cover, because cover that is only cover is detectable. She was echoing her own words from the valley, from the conversation before he had left, and he recognized the echo as deliberate, a test of whether the understanding he had carried out of the valley was the same understanding she had sent him out with, or whether 5 months of operations work had modified it in ways that needed to be examined. A genuine role that produces legitimate proximity, he said. Yes. The rating game circuit has put me in the spaces where Veil operates. Veil has offered introductions to the inner circle. The inner circle includes Atsuki as an instructor. The legitimate proximity exists, or can be made to exist through the existing structure. And when you are in the room with Atsuki, Shirogane said, what do you say to her? The question was the hardest one he had been asked in the entire operation, because the answer was not obvious and because getting it wrong would not just fail the contact but close the window, potentially permanently. Nothing about the document, he said. Nothing about the operation. Nothing that tells her there is a channel before the channel has been established in both directions. He thought about Mio's packaging principles, about the rhetoric of the true, about the specific error of giving information before the recipient has any basis for evaluating its source. I ask her the questions. The structural questions she asked in the gathering room. I asked them the way she asked them, as genuine questions, not as prompts, not as performances of interest. As a person who has the same questions she has and is asking them to someone who might have useful things to say. Shirogane looked at him. And if she is not ready? I ask the questions and I receive whatever answer she gives and I do not push beyond it. The questions are their own message. She will know, when she hears them, that the person asking them has been in the same interior space she has been in. That is sufficient for the first contact. A long pause. The valley was very quiet around them. Somewhere in the upper branches of the trees, something moved without making a sound that was distinguishable from the sound of the forest moving in the late afternoon light. You have learned, Shirogane said, to think in the correct language. He stayed in the valley for 2 days. He ran the perimeter exercise on the second morning, completing it in full dark, and arrived at all 7 positions without detection, and Keiro was waiting at the settlement entrance when he returned and she said nothing for a full minute, which was the most significant compliment she had given him, and then she said, the 7th position. You waited. You felt the approach before you moved. Yes, he said. That is the difference, she said, between the second grammar and the first. The first grammar responds to what it perceives. The second grammar waits for the perception to be complete before it responds. Most beings cannot sustain the wait. It gets easier, he said. No, she said. It gets more familiar. There is a difference. Chapter 14. The first genuine conversation. The invitation Vale did not know he was giving. He returned from the valley on a Thursday and contacted Vale on Friday, which was 2 days earlier than his normal pattern of initiating contact, a deliberate deviation calculated to register as eagerness rather than the routine cadence of a maintained relationship. Mio had suggested this. After a period of absence from the social circuit, the appropriate re-entry signal was one that communicated renewed engagement without performing it, and eagerness was more convincing when expressed through the deviation from an established pattern than when expressed through direct statement. Vale was available. They met on Saturday at a venue in Akasaka that was new to their meeting geography, selected by Vale, which meant it was a venue associated with his professional rather than his social life, the kind of choice that indicated the relationship was being moved, from Vale's side, into a more explicitly operational register. You have been away, Vale said. Training, Issei said. It was true. There are methods I have been developing that require extended periods of practice away from the circuit. The circuit is a good environment for competition but not ideal for certain kinds of development. Vale received this with the attention he brought to information that had multiple possible interpretations. The people I mentioned, he said. The individuals in the network who would find your perspective interesting. One of them is hosting a discussion series at the end of the month. Monthly format, small group, focused on governance philosophy in the context of the rating game system's historical development. She has been running it for 2 years. The participants are people who take the structural questions seriously. Issei said. Rei Atsuki. You may know the name from the administrative literature. She has been in senior positions for close to 20 years, well regarded, serious thinker on governance questions. He was careful to let approximately 2 seconds pass before responding, which was the duration that would register as genuine consideration rather than prepared response. I have come across some of her written work, he said. She asked the right questions? Vale looked at him with a quality of attention that was slightly sharper than his usual mode. Yes, he said. She does. I thought you might appreciate meeting her. I would, Issei said. What Vale did not know, because there was no way he could have known, was that he had just given Issei the precise access that the operation had needed and had been unable to design for, because the access came through a legitimate social introduction rather than any engineered approach, which meant it would register in Atsuki's assessment of the contact as entirely organic. The contact was not designed. The contact was the natural result of Vale's professional relationship building, bringing two people with genuine shared questions into the same room. The only element of design was Issei's. And the design was not the meeting. The design was the approach, the two questions he would ask, the way he would ask them, the space he would leave for the answers, the specific quality of listening that would signal to Atsuki that she was being heard by someone who understood the questions from the inside rather than from the outside. The discussion series and its atmosphere. The discussion series was held in a private room of a club in Shinjuku that served the mid to senior tier of the supernatural administrative community. 8 people. A round table that prevented the hierarchical seating that rectangular tables imposed. Wine that nobody drank much of because the conversation was the actual consumption. Atsuki ran it with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been managing serious conversations for long enough that the management was invisible. She opened with a framing question that was specific enough to focus the discussion without being narrow enough to constrain it. She tracked the threads of the conversation without appearing to direct them. And she knew when to let something sit unresolved and when to provide the summary sentence that allowed the group to move forward without feeling that they had abandoned an important point. She was 51. She had the quality of people who have spent a long time in rooms where important things are decided and have formed, through that experience, a comprehensive theory of how important things actually get decided, as opposed to how the formal structures around them claim they get decided. The theory was visible in the way she listened, not with the attentive receptivity of someone collecting information but with the specific quality of someone cross-referencing what they are hearing against a model they have been refining for decades. Issei recognized this quality. He had encountered versions of it in Shirogane, in Mio, in Natsuki. It was the quality of a long education. He said almost nothing for the first hour and a half. He listened with the attention that Nagi had taught him, the distributed awareness that processed all channels at roughly equal priority, and he built a picture of the room, who was asking questions for the discussion's benefit, and who was asking questions for their own information, who had positions they were testing against the group and who had positions they had already decided, and were now observing how others arrived at them. Who was learning and who was teaching and who was doing something more complicated than either. Atsuki was doing something more complicated than either. She was teaching the framework of the questions while simultaneously examining whether the framework was adequate. She was the teacher who was also the most advanced student, using the seminar structure to externalize an internal inquiry that was too large for any single person's private attention. In the second hour, the conversation arrived at the structural question from an oblique angle, a discussion about the historical development of the rating game system's governance framework had produced, through several steps that Issei had observed but not directed. A moment in which the gap between the governance framework's stated purposes and its operational history was directly visible to everyone in the room without anyone having explicitly named it. The room paused in the way that rooms pause when something true has arrived. Issei said into that pause, "Who determined which historical contingencies were worth recovering and which were not?" He said it the way Atsuki had said it in the gathering room in January. Not as an argument. Not as a provocation. As a genuine question from someone sitting inside the same interior space that the question came from. The room was quiet for a moment with a quality different from the previous quiet. This was the quiet of recognition, not the quiet of something true arriving but the quiet of something true being recognized by the person who had last said it, who was now hearing it from someone else. Atsuki looked at him across the round table. The cross-referencing quality of her attention was engaged at full intensity. "It is the foundational question," she said. Her voice had a different quality than it had carried for the previous 90 minutes, less of the seminar register, more of something direct. And the answer to it determines everything about whether the framework being recovered is the framework that was actually lost or a construction that uses the language of recovery to describe something that was never there to begin with. "You have been asking it for a long time," he said. A pause that was very precise in its duration. "Yes," she said. "Have you?" I came to it from a different direction, he said. But I arrived at the same question. The conversation moved on. The other 6 people in the room moved the discussion into its next phase, and the round table fulfilled its structural function of distributing the conversation rather than concentrating it. Atsuki continued to manage the seminar with the invisible efficiency of long practice. But twice in the remaining 40 minutes, when the conversation produced a moment where a direct exchange was natural rather than conspicuous, she directed a question at Issei rather than at the room. Not the structural question again. Different questions, specific to the content of the discussion, but questions with the same quality, questions from someone who was testing whether the person across the table understood the territory or was mapping it for the first time. He answered both questions from the territory, not the map, because the valley and the 5 months of operations work and the collective's accumulated reading of the situation had given him genuine familiarity with the terrain, and genuine familiarity was what Atsuki was evaluating for, and it was the only thing that would pass her evaluation. At the end of the evening, in the brief informal period that followed the formal discussion, she came to stand near him in the way that people come to stand near someone when they have decided something and are looking for the right phrasing. You should come to the next session, she said. I would like that, he said. I mean, she said, more precisely, with the precision of someone who wanted to be understood correctly, that you should come to the next session. There are things that this format allows that the other formats do not. He received this with the stillness that was his first discipline, the grammar that the valley had given him before any other. He received it completely, without rushing to interpret it or respond to it before the receiving was done. He let it arrive. Then he said, I understood what you meant, and she looked at him for one more moment with the comprehensive attention of 19 years of private inquiry finally finding a direction it could move in. And then she said good night to the room and left, and Issei finished his wine, which was actually quite good, and stayed in the room for another 10 minutes talking about raiding game strategy with 2 of the other attendees, maintaining the grammar of his cover with the automatic ease of something that had been practiced into the body. And then he walked out into the April night, and the city received him as it always received him now, as a feature of itself rather than a visitor to itself. His passage undisturbing and his attention distributed and the operation alive inside him like the operation was supposed to be alive, not as a plan being executed but as a continuing present tense reality that was still unfolding into its own future, still incomplete in the specific and necessary way of things that are genuinely in their middle rather than already at their end. He walked for a long time before he went back to the room above the stationery shop. He walked through the Shinjuku streets, and the smaller streets that led away from Shinjuku toward the quieter neighborhoods, and he walked the way the valley had taught him to walk, and the city around him was full of the invisible weight of all the private accommodations that people were making and the private reconsiderations that they were conducting in the interiors of their own attention. All the fragile commitments, and the long-held conclusions and the questions that had been waiting for the right exterior in which to become sayable. And none of it was visible from the surface of the city, and all of it was real, and it was in motion now, a motion that had been set in motion before it was visible and that would continue after this particular night was over and after this particular walk was over. Oren Vale had promised introductions. In the offices of the Conservative Interests Advisory Body, in the rooms where the doctrinal instruction sessions continued on their bi-weekly schedule, in the atmospheric accumulation of intention that Natsuki was still reading and the residue that Rin was still calibrating, the people with fragile commitments were sitting with their incompleteness, waiting, though they did not know it, for the recognition that was coming toward them in the packaging that Mio was still designing, through the channel that Issei was still building, at the moment that the garden would be ready. Not yet. But not never either. Rei Atsuki had 19 years of accumulated truth inside her, and she had just looked across a round table at someone who had asked the right question, and in her face in that moment was the specific expression of a person who has found the direction they have been looking for and is now, for the first time in a very long time, looking in it rather than away from it. The middle of things has its own kind of certainty. The sentence was being written. The garden was growing. The second grammar, invisible and patient, was doing the only thing it had ever been designed to do, arriving in the places that the first grammar could not reach, in the forms that the first grammar could not prepare against, carrying the truth that the first grammar had been using noise to drown out and that, in the quiet that the second grammar created, could now be heard.